So it is 9:46 and we are live streaming here. So I think we can go ahead and get started. We'll wait a few minutes, make sure everyone's here. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So let me introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Brett Davis. I'm excited to hear his talk today. He's professor in Higgins Chair in Philosophy at Loyola University, Maryland. He had his PhD from Vanderbilt and has been visiting professor at various places, including Freiburg and Kyoto. He works in East Asian philosophy, the Kyoto School, which is where I know most of his work from, as well as in continental philosophy, Heidegger phenomenology, and cross-cultural philosophy, the intersection of Western phenomenology and Kyoto School. He's worked a lot on Ueda Shitsutaro and under him, and I've benefited a lot from his work on Ueda. He's taught at the graduate level in Japan, in Germany. He has many books and articles I would recommend reading. Just one book I'll mention is the Oxford Handbook for Japanese Philosophy. I think this is the Oxford Handbook, right? So this is with Oxford UP. And today we're going to hear a talk on trans-mysticism, Ueda Shitsutaro on Zen after Meister Eckhart. So please, Brett, take it away.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you. A strange other side of the world experience. It's 9:50 at night for me, but I guess it's 9:40 in the morning for you.
Yeah. Thanks for talking late. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, let me mention also before I get started that Greg Moss just finished a translation of Ueda's very first and programmatic essay on Eckhart and Zen by Ueda. And it originally came out in the book that was based on his dissertation written in German. There's a new edition of the German book out, and it's the final chapter. After the whole book's on Eckhart, but the final chapter he was encouraged to write about Zen as well, comparing Eckhart to Zen. And that push kind of led him to a whole career of writing about Eckhart and Zen. So that first programmatic piece is going to be coming out very shortly online, and then in print in a special issue of the journal Comparative and Continental Philosophy. And the whole issue is on Ueda. Okay, so let me jump right into it. Can I can I share a PowerPoint? Will that work? Oh, okay, I will share this PowerPoint then. Let me see. So if I minimize that, okay, that shows up okay. All right, so the title of my talk is Trans-Mysticism, Ueda Shitsutaro on Zen after Meister Eckhart. And I have 3 introductory quotations here, but I'll let you read those and I will jump right into it. Ueda Shitsutaro. His dates are 1926, and he passed away just a few years ago in 2019. He was the central figure of the 3rd generation of the Kyoto School tradition of Japanese philosophy. He's best known for his original interpretive developments of the philosophy of Nishida Kitaro, the founder of the Kyoto School. Also his interpretations of Meister Eckhart and of what he calls the thoroughgoing non-mysticism of Zen Buddhism. His interpretations of Eckhart and Zen, and specifically his thought of non-mysticism, will be the topic of my talk today. What Ueda means by non-mysticism, in German he refers to this as nicht Mystik, and in Japanese as hi shinpishugi. It's not a simple rejection, however, but rather a movement through and out of mysticism. It's both a fulfillment of the genuine thrust of mysticism and a breakthrough beyond mystical union. In a conversation that I had with Professor Ueda at his home in 2006, he graciously agreed with my suggestion that this dynamic movement through and out of mysticism may be more appropriately referred to as trans-mysticism, trans-mystique, or tsuka shimpishugi, or perhaps even better, a little less familiar way to put it, but perhaps demysticism, or especially the German Entmystik. Japanese would be datsu shimpishugi. The manifold senses of the German prefix ent may be particularly appropriate here, since it can signify an actualization and a development of a potential, as in entflammen or entwickeln, as well as an undoing and removal of a burden, as in entfesseln, entladen, and entgiften. An entmystik could thus be understood both, on the one hand, as a commencement and development of mysticism, and on the other hand, as a shedding of and release from mysticism. The English prefix de also has this dual sense, and so demysticism would be also be an appropriate locution. For clarity's sake, however, I'm going to use the expression trans-mysticism, meaning that it goes all the way through and beyond, through tsu and beyond ka mysticism. Non- or trans-mysticism involves a double negation, a releasement from the ego, and then from God. God is let go of for the sake of nothing, that is, for an experience of absolute nothingness, which in turn returns us to a direct engagement of the here and now of everyday activity. The aim of this paper is to explicate and elaborate on Ueda's account of this dynamic movement of non- or trans-mysticism. In doing so, I will refer specifically to Ueda's works, but I'll also be looking at those works, or I'll be looking through the lenses of those works at certain writings of Eckhart and Zen. Before looking at how Ueda develops his thought of non- or trans-mysticism through his interpretations of Eckhart and Zen, let me begin with a schematic overview of the idea. Non-mysticism as trans-mysticism is not a static state of being, but rather a movement through negation to affirmation, and then on to a second negation, and finally back to a radical reaffirmation. It is thus a movement made up of the following four moments. 1, an ecstatic transcendence of the ego. 2, a mystical union with God or the One. 3, an ecstatic breakthrough beyond God or the One into an absolute nothingness. And then finally 4, a return to an ecstatic, instatic engagement in the here and now. Despite this analysis into 4 apparently discrete moments, these ideally make up a single fluid movement from 1 to 4. Yet, what Ueda calls mysticism, in the narrow sense, stops short at the second moment. In other words, mysticism consists of a conjunction of the first and second moments only. What is distinctive of non-mysticism as trans-mysticism is the addition to these first 2 moments the conjunction of the third and fourth moments. The third and fourth moments of this complete movement of trans-mysticism together make up a double negation. One must let go not only of the habitual identification with the self-encapsulated ego, but also of the mystical experience of union with the divine. The first moment, the transcendence of the ego, is perhaps common to all forms of religion. The second moment, the experience of union with God, is often considered to be the hallmark of mystical experience. The third moment, the breakthrough beyond mystical union to an absolute nothingness, can be understood as a self-overcoming of mysticism. And the fourth moment, the return to an ecstatic, instatic activity in the midst of the everyday world completes this self-overcoming process of transmysticism. We can understand this entire movement of transmysticism in terms of a series of ecstasies. Ecstasy, in the strict sense of ekstasis, literally a standing outside oneself, which implies, as the Japanese term for this, datsuji, literally means a shedding of the ego self. This is an initial prerequisite for the mystical union. Yet, as mysticism intensifies towards transmysticism, beyond this initial ecstasis, beyond this letting go of the ego for the sake of union with God, we find a second ecstasis, a letting go of God for the sake of nothing. That is, for the sake of an experience of absolute nothingness. This absolute nothingness is not an apophatic indicator of an ineffably transcendent Godhead beyond God. It is not a negative theological sign for something wholly other that lies beyond being. Rather, Ueda understands absolute nothingness dynamically as what he calls the activity of emptying out, kukai no hataraki, that is, as the ecstatic movement of transmysticism itself. He also understands absolute nothingness topologically, as the open expanse, wherein the true self is realized in and as an ecstatic engagement with the everyday world. The true self is realized as a self that is not a self, a phrase that he takes up from his teacher Nishitani Keiji, jiko narazaru jiko, in the sense that it is itself only in not being itself. The self is itself only in not being itself. That is to say, the true self realizes itself as an ekstasis in stasis, as a standing outside of itself and into a non-dual engagement with other persons, things, and events. While the ego self mistakes itself as a closed circuit of self-affirmation in saying, I am I, a closed circuit of self-affirmation, the true self is a dialectical movement in which self-affirmation is reached only by way of self-negation. The identity of such a self can be expressed, Ueda says, with the phrase, I, in not being I, am I. In the process of transmysticism, moreover, not only the ego, but God or Buddha, too, must be negated, let go of, or in Dogen's terms, dropped off. Thus, Ueda, following his teacher Nishitani Keiji, speaks of Zen as a mode of body-mind dropped-off mysticism. Shinpishugi no shinjin datsuraku. Shinpishugi no shinjin datsuraku, a mode of body-mind dropped-off mysticism. The genuine thrust of mysticism finds fulfillment in its own self-abnegation. The movement of this thrust through and beyond mysticism is what is meant by non-mysticism as transmysticism. In Ueda's own words, if we provisionally divide the entire dynamic of from union to ecstasis into two segments, referring to the moment of union with the usual term mysticism, and naming the moment of ecstasis in particular as non-mysticism, then my intent is to attempt to clarify the relation and connection between these two aspects. I regard true mysticism as the entire movement from union to ecstasis, that is to say, the entire movement from mysticism to non-mysticism. So here you see him saying, true mysticism is non-mysticism. Hence, up to the point of including the moment of to non-mysticism. In fact, in this case, the expression mysticism ceases to be fitting. It is no longer appropriate. True mysticism is not mysticism. Rather, it is appropriate to call it non-mysticism, with mysticism as a springboard to go beyond and shed mysticism by means of the ecstatic thrust inherent in mysticism itself. This is what we can speak of as the mode of body-mind dropped-off mysticism. Unquote. Ueda defines the core of mysticism as the unio mystica, the experience of union with God. It should be noted in passing that other religious experiences, such as that of a mysterium tremendum et fascinans, or of a loving interpersonal rapture, so long as they remain dualistic, would be considered not yet perfectly mystical. For Ueda, such experiences of theophany or communion, however extraordinary, are still on the way to a non-dual union with the divine. In his interpretation of Meister Eckhart, Ueda subordinates the birth motif to the breakthrough motif. This is what his first book is about, these two motifs in Eckhart. In the first, the birth motif, a union with God is brought about by the way of the birth of Christ in the soul. In complete passivity, one receives the Son of God in and as one's own soul. In the words of Paul, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Since the Son is in essence one with the Father, human persons thus become united with the person of God. The breakthrough motif is more radical still. So this is Ueda reading Eckhart, demanding as it does an ecstasis not only of the soul, but also of the person of God as the transcendent creator. Here Eckhart speaks of letting go of God for the sake of God. For example, so this is Eckhart now. Therefore I pray to God that he may make me free of God. For my real being is above God, if we take God to be the beginning of created things. In the breaking through, I come to be free of my will and of God's will. So there's the two breakthroughs for Ueda. Free of my will and of God's will, and of all his works, and of God himself. Unquote. Eckhart goes on to say that in this breaking through I receive that God and I are one. But the God that is united with here is no longer the divine person. It is rather the Godhead, Gottheit, as the impersonal, or perhaps trans or pre-personal, essence of divinity. Moreover, elsewhere Eckhart makes clear that beyond the passive reception of the birth of the Son in the soul, what he calls the little spark in the soul actively seeks to unite with the transpersonal Godhead beyond the Trinity, with the divine ground, or Grund, beyond or before any personification and indeed any determination whatsoever of God. Eckhart's radical mysticism aims not at a communion with an not a communion with an interpersonal other. For the spark in the soul wants nothing but God, naked, just as he is. It wants to get into its simple ground, into the silent desert, into which no distinction ever gazed, of Father, Son, or Holy Ghost. Eckhart indeed sometimes speaks of this silent desert of the Godhead in apophatic terms as nothingness, neat. Furthermore, Eckhart does not stop at a contemplative absorption in a mystical nothingness. In his account of the story of Mary and Martha, Eckhart reverses the traditional interpretation, which uses the story to assert the preeminence of the vita contemplativa of Mary over the vita activa of Martha, to claim that Martha's activity, this is Eckhart's interpretation, Martha's activity, busy about many things, is in fact a profounder expression of union with God than the passivity of Mary, who remained seated at Jesus' feet. Martha's busyness expresses the pure activity, what Eckhart calls the Luther Wirken, which comes directly out of God. More radically put, the life of this pure activity might be said to arise without why, ohne warum, out of the silent desert of absolute nothingness. If one were to ask, so in this image is very much a painting of an Eckhartian interpretation of the story, because you have here Martha front and center, busy about many things in the kitchen, preparing the food, while Mary is sitting in the background, barely visible in the background, sitting at Jesus's feet. So this is why Ueda likes this painting and uses it in his book. If one were to ask Martha why she lives a life of good works, the answer could no longer refer to any outside reason or ground, not for the sake of God, nor for the sake of the moral law, and certainly not for the sake of salvation. Eckhart writes, "If anyone were to ask a truthful man who works out of his own ground, 'Why are you performing your works?' and if he were to give a straight answer, he would say nothing else than, 'I work, therefore I work.' When one lives from out of the abyssal grunt of indistinction, one no longer seeks an external reason for one's works. For now, life lives out of its own ground and springs from its own source," as Eckhart puts it. For this life of ecstatic engagement, having let go of the subjective inside, there can no longer be, nor is there any need for, an external objective answer to the question, why? The life of blessedness and justice would be, at bottom, like Angelus Silesius' rose, without why. One varum. So that's Eckhart, and especially Eckhart read through Ueda's eyes. Now Zen. Ueda finds profound resonances between Eckhart's breakthrough beyond the unio mystica to an absolute nothingness and back into a pure activity without why, that is, without explanatory reference to a transcendent ground, and the path of Zen Buddhism. As is well known, Zen discourages reliance on an other power, tariki. Indeed, insofar as one is inclined to cling to the Buddha as a transcendent other, one must, as Zen Master Lenji says, kill the Buddha, along with all other attachments and projections of the ego. Rather than calling on an other power, Zen calls for a direct pointing to the human mind, seeing into one's true nature, and becoming a Buddha. That's the definition of Zen attributed to Bodhidharma. Moreover, as Hakuin reminds us in his Zazen Wasan, the Song of Zazen, this Buddha nature, or self-nature, Jisho, is in truth no nature, Musho. It is not the essence of a substantial being, but rather the activity of a spontaneous freedom and compassionate openness. The Buddha mind is in truth no mind, Mushin, which refers not to a meditative absorption in nothingness, but rather to the sincere everyday mind, Byōjōshin, of an ecstatically intimate engagement in the activity of the here and now, whether it be washing your bowls, carrying firewood, or carrying a woman across a stream. To mention three famous stories from Zen. This everyday no-mind of total engagement in the here and now is both the nearest thing to and the farthest thing from our usual mental state of being. This distinguishing feature of Buddhism, writes Nishtani, consists in it being a religion of the absolute near side. So rather than the far side, the other shore, he says, really Buddhism, especially Zen, is about the near side. He speaks of transcendence rather than transcendence. But because this absolute near side, like Meister Eckhart's Gottheit, lies nearer to the self than the self is to itself, it is necessary to speak of it as a transcendent near side. A transdescendance to this absolute near side can be made only by way of radically stepping back through a thoroughgoing process of negation or letting go. This theme of letting go is pervasive in Zen. Even the thought or conceit of having let go of everything is to be let go of. It's a famous story, a koan, Yang asked Jiaozhou, famous Zen master, Chan master Jiaozhou, how about when one arrives carrying not a single thing? In other words, having let go of all attachments. Jiaozhou responds, cast that down. In other words, let go of your attachment to the idea of having let go of all attachments. Dogen, who also uses the expression casting down the body-mind. So this casting down, hoge in Japanese, is also the Zen phrase used by some Kyoto school philosophers, including Ueda, to translate Eckhart's Gelassenheit. So in Dogen, shinjin hoge, letting go, casting down body and mind. Dogen most famously speaks of this liberating experience of letting go in terms of a dropping off the body-mind, shinjin datsuraku. This casting off is not undertaken for the sake of taking leave of psychophysical existence, but rather so that the free and unattached use can be made of the body-mind dropped off. So Dogen then turns the phrase around, datsuraku shinjin. In Dogen's double formulation, dropping off the body-mind dropped off, we find succinctly expressed the circular movement of transmysticism, whereby everyday human existence is radically negated, reifications and attachments dropped off, and then reaffirmed, freely and compassionately picked up again. This movement of negation and reaffirmation is also succinctly formulated in the Heart Sutra's well-known lines, form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Emptiness negates attachment to a reification of forms, but is itself empty of independent substantiality. Emptiness too is empty. Although it is the identical essence to which all phenomena can be reduced, it is essentially nothing other than the interdependent origination of singular phenomenal events. Hence, as emptiness or absolute nothingness, the one, or rather as Nishitani puts it, the none beyond the one, does not dissolve, but rather enables the distinct presencing of the many. A monk asked Jiaozhou, all things are returned to the one, but where does the one return to? Jiaozhou said, when I was in Qingzhou, I made a hempen shirt. It weighed 7 pounds. Following Ueda, we can interpret this dialogue as follows. The one is here the unio mystica, the absolute, which embraces the self and all things. In the parlance of Zen, this is expressed as heaven and earth and I are of the same root. All things and I are of one body. But while this mystical absorption may be a necessary moment, it becomes a trap if one sets up a dwelling there. Nanchuan responds to a monk's reiteration of the above statement by pointing to a flower and saying, people these days see this flower as though they were in a dream. To see a flower such as it presents itself, not as an object standing over against my ego, and not as a homogeneous part of the self or Buddha, one must pass through and wake up from the profound yet precarious dream of the one. Dream of oneness, you could say. A oneness that does not allow for differences. Ueda writes, all things are returned to the one. To begin with, for Zen too, all is one. And it is necessary to directly stand at this standpoint of the one, where all things lose their differences and distinctions, and the equality of one taste is thoroughly apprehended. This experience is indispensable. However, Zen is found neither in the view that all things return to the one, nor in the experience of that one. If we simply extract this moment, what we have is rather one more common example of a standpoint of mysticism. Going beyond the standpoint of this provisional precondition only when it is asked, where does the one return to? Does a world open up wherein Zen can exhibit its original element? According to Zen, the truth of the one is none and yet many. Munishite ta. Here, the many is the variety of the one, and the one is the oneness of the many. And this dynamic relation itself is the concrete body of the one, that is, of absolute nothingness. Ueda is fond of making the seemingly abstract philosophy of this dynamic trans-mysticism concrete by way of commenting on the Zen classic, The 10 Oxherding Pictures. In the first 6 pictures, a boy searches for an ox, his true self, finds its traces, sees it directly, catches and tames it, leads, and then rides it home. The 7th picture can be understood as representing both the peaceful power and the potential danger of the mystical union. Here the boy, having merged with and finally forgotten the ox, that is, having overcome the duality between his ego and his true self, sits at peace with himself, or, as some versions have it, sings his praises to the moon, a traditional metaphor for enlightenment. He has realized his enlightened Buddha self. But the 8th picture, the empty circle, which Ueda understands as the experience of the place of absolute nothingness, radically breaks through the unio mystica, and indeed through every possible attachment, every possible reification, every possible dwelling in sanctimonious self-satisfaction. Ueda then reads the last 3 pictures as a dynamic set. So these last 3 pictures are no longer a progression, but he reads them as a circulating dynamic set. The empty circle of the 8th picture as the absolutely denuding experience of emptiness. The river and tree of the 9th picture as the egoless suchness of natural phenomena. And the sage returning to the marketplace and greeting a boy of the 10th picture as the compassionately engaged interpersonal encounter. While the first 7 pictures recount the necessary path toward ecstatic mysticism or self-realization, it is the forgetting the self, in the leap into a circling between the last 3 pictures, that for Ueda portrays the ultimate dynamic of Zen's transmysticism. Okay, so that we went through Eckhart's transmysticism and now Zen's transmysticism, and now we'll see how he compares and contrasts them. At the beginning and again near the end of his book, Non-Mysticism, this is the Non-Mysticism, Eckhart and Zen. Hi Shimpishugi Eckhart to Zen. This is the 8th of his collected works, volume 8. And at the beginning and then again near the end of this collection, Ueda tells us that he was inspired by the brief comments made by Rudolf Otto on Eckhart and Zen in an appendix to Otto's book, Mysticism, East and West. In reference to a presentation of the 10 Oxherding Pictures by D.T. Suzuki, Otto affirms that we Westerners can at best only gain access to the strange world of experience in this mysticism of an entirely peculiar character by starting out from Eckhart, and only from a few of his rarest and deepest moments. The main focus of Otto's comparative study is the Christian mysticism of Meister Eckhart, So I'm going to take this occasion to delve into Otto's book a bit and see how he compares Christian mysticism of Meister Eckhart with the Advaita Vedanta of Shankara. So with this famous Hindu mystical tradition of philosophy and religion. And that will help us then we'll go back to Zen, and that will help us see what's distinctive in Zen. Although in the first part of his book, this is Mysticism East and West by Rudolf Otto, he explores a number of profound similarities between these two, between Eckhart and Shankara, Eckhart and Advaita Vedanta of Shankara. In the latter part of his book, Otto investigates their differences and his preference for the ultimately world-reaffirming vitality of Eckhart's dynamic mysticism over against what he sees as the life-denying and static mysticism of Shankara. It becomes clear. So I'm not going to take up the case of Shankara and Advaita Vedanta and offer a rebuttal to Otto. I'm just going to present Otto's presentation, comparison and contrast with Eckhart, so that we can get clear on how he's seeing that, and then how that will help us understand Zen better. So this is Otto now. The goal for Shankara is the stilling of all karmani, all works, all activity of will. It is quietism, tyaga, a surrender of the will and of doing, an abandonment of good as of evil works, for both bind man to the world of wandering, of samsara. The real being does not work. It would be possible to find even in Eckhart the most astonishingly parallel passages, and to make him also into a quietist. And we ourselves have done it above. So he's saying in the first half of his book, when he explored their profoundly similar moments, that's what he's referring to. It would then be possible to find counter passages, which show him to be the most zealous actualist, Eckhart he's talking about. He could be drawn in this way into the most hopeless contradictions, but there would be no realization of the profound unity of his fundamental intuition. In some ways, this intuition reminds one of the paradoxical Mahayana doctrine, nirvana is samsara. So it's interesting here, in contrasting Eckhart with Shankara, he makes reference to Mahayana Buddhism. Eckhart's position is neither mystical quietism nor secular activity, but an identity of the deepest unity and the most vivid multiplicity, and therefore of the most profound quiet and the most vital motion. Both masters seek and behold, so Eckhart and Shankara, both masters seek and behold unity and the eternal one in contrast to multiplicity. But with this difference, the relationship of the one to the many is for Shankara one of strict exclusion, but for Eckhart one of the most lively polarity. Shankara, in his Paravidya, is a strict monist, but not like Eckhart, a philosophy of identity as regards the one and the many. Unquote. That's a remarkable passage, I think, very illuminating, although once again, it would be interesting to ask a Advaita Vedantin what they thought of that interpretation. Eckhart's paradoxical co-affirmations of the one and the many, and of profound stillness in the midst of vibrant activity, do indeed bear striking resemblances to the transmysticism of Zen. But let us look further at Otto's account of the structure and orientation of Eckhart's thought. He explains the dynamism in Eckhart's mysticism along the same lines as what Bernard McGuinness has more recently called the metaphysics of flow, made up of a circular movement between a flowing out, an exitus, effluxus, Utsfließen in Eckhart's Middle High German, from the indistinct Godhead, and a flowing back, a reditus, a refluxus, an Ingang, to this ineffable source. In this regard, Otto writes, God is in himself tremendous life movement. Out of the undifferentiated unity he enters into the multiplicity of personal life and persons, in whom the world, and therewith the multiplicity of the world, is contained. Out of this he returns back into the eternal original unity. The river flows into itself. But it is not an error to be corrected by him, that he is eternally going out from and entering into himself. It is a fact that has meaning and value, as the expression of life manifesting its potentiality and fullness. The issuing forth becomes itself the goal again of that process enriched by the course of its circuit. One might think that this metaphysics of flow bears striking resemblances to the circulation found in Zen's path of transmysticism. And yet there remains, I think, a crucial difference in primary and ultimate orientation. Despite the world-affirming character of Eckhart's thought, his metaphysics of flow begins and ends with the Godhead, as a trans-worldly source and eschatological end of the created world. The path of Zen, on the other hand, begins and ends with the everyday world. Life in the midst of the non-dual multiplicity of the world is affirmatively engaged in by way of passing through and beyond the one, as opposed to the world being affirmed as an outflow of and pathway back to the Godhead. Whereas Eckhart's metaphysics of flow begins and ends with the Godhead, beyond God in heaven, Zen's transmysticism begins and ends here on earth, with the oak tree in the garden, with 3 pounds of flax in our hands, or even with a shit stick laying at our feet. These are all famous stories in Zen, if you're not familiar with them. According to Ueda, Eckhart comes to the point to almost the same world. Eckhart comes to point to almost the same world as Zen, when, beyond the death and rebirth found in dying to the self for the sake of being reborn in the life of God, he intimates a thoroughgoing great death and a rebirth from out of an absolute nothingness. But after exploring their profound resonances, Ueda goes on to mark a number of critical distinctions between Eckhart and Zen, distinctions which imply that the latter offers in the end a more thoroughgoing path of transmysticism. To begin with, Eckhart's sole concern is said to be with the soul's relation to God, and he pays little attention to the world of nature. Whereas, for Zen, natural phenomena express the very concrescence of the non-egoity of the true self. To be sure, Eckhart does not only denigrate creatures as nothing, in the negative sense of a privation of being on their own. Creatures are nothing, he says, because they're nothing on their own. They're absolutely void of being on their own. But he also talks of learning to see all things in God. But unlike Zen, he does not let go of God so as to simply affirm the suchness of natural phenomena. That is, things such as they present themselves as they are with nothing but the empty expanse, within nothing but the empty expanse of absolute nothingness. Quoting Eckhart as saying, "To one who looks at a stick in the divine light, the stick looks like an angel." Ueda writes, Eckhart's affirmation of the stick is not an affirmation of the stick as stick, but of the stick as an angel in divine light. Zen Buddhism speaks more straightforwardly, mountain as mountain, water as water. Moreover, for Eckhart, the human interpersonal relation remains mediated by the soul's relation to God. Whereas for Zen, the place of interpersonal betweenness is ultimately nothing but the open expanse of the empty circle. Ueda illustrates this point by way of comparing two pictures. On the one hand, the 10th of the Oxfording pictures, which shows the old recluse returning to the town and greeting a young boy, with nothing within nothing but the empty circle. So he says, that here the person realizes that all along everything has been taking place within the empty circle. And he contrasts this with a painting of the Mary and Martha story that we've already seen, which shows Martha working in the kitchen in the foreground and Mary kneeling before Jesus in the distant background. Even as Martha turns from contemplation, that is, from mysticism, to action, to transmysticism, the significance of her activity appears to remain anchored by this withdrawing yet still present reference to transcendence. So, in other words, Ueda is saying this, even though it recedes into the background, it's still there, this reference to transcendence. And in fact, it's in the very center of the picture. That would have to totally disappear for it to become this, for it to become Zen, is what Ueda is saying. In the final analysis, Ueda concludes, Eckhart's nothingness remains a negative theological sign pointing towards an inexpressibly higher being. In the case of Eckhart, is a quote now, because of the excellence of the supra-being, the Überwesen, of God's being, it is called nothingness. When all is said and done, Eckhart's nothingness of the absolute, zettai nomu, is an adjective modifying a substance. In contrast, Zen's absolute nothingness, zettai mu, is a verb referring to the activity of emptying out. In short, despite Eckhart's most radical moments of breaking through the strictures of mysticism into the freedom of transmysticism, Ueda finds metaphysical residues in his thought which impede the realization of the suchness of things in absolute nothingness, and which inhibit the free and compassionate life without why, without the question why. Only in Zen does Ueda find the nothing push through to a transcendence of transcendence, a negation of negation that enables a profound and intimate reaffirmation of the everyday. He writes, the negation of negation in Zen Buddhism is thus the beyond negation, and, at one with this, a sheer affirmation, that is, an utter affirmation of the everyday as such. It is a matter of the unity of infinite negation and utter affirmation, the unity of the thither, jenseits des jenseits, and the hither of the hither, diesseits des diesseits. Whereas in Eckhart's thought, it is the category of substance that is in the last analysis definitive. Zen's absolute nothingness dissolves substance thinking. Put in philosophical terms, this is again a quote from Ueda here. Put in philosophical terms, absolute nothingness refers to the negation of negation, which entails a pure movement in two directions at the same time. One, the negation of negation in the sense of a further denial of negation that does not come back around to affirmation, but opens up into an endlessly open nothingness. And two, the negation of negation in the sense of a return to affirmation without any trace of mediation. So the trace of mediation in the picture, right, is Christ in the background, the mediator, Christ the mediator. One might be left here with the impression, so I'm coming now to my conclusion. One might be left here with the impression that Zen's path of transmysticism, While it may indeed offer its practitioners a profound source of ethical virtue, is first of all a profoundly demanding religious endeavor. To be sure, to follow this path to the end demands the ultimate experience of what Zen calls the Great Death. The ego must completely perish, not, to be sure, by way of an escapist death to life, but rather by way of an unreserved dying into the non-dual activity of engaged living. So not a dying to life, but a dying into life. Yet one may wonder, is the pathway to this utter re-engagement in life then only open to the very few who are capable not just of becoming mystics, but furthermore of breaking through and beyond mysticism? Right? You might think, oh, it's hard enough to become a mystic. Now I'm told that I have to go through and beyond mysticism. In fact, however, Ueda often brings this apparently lofty path of trans-mysticism back down to the level of the everyday. To begin with, he suggests that the dynamic circling between the final three ox-herding pictures can be understood not just as a distant course for enlightened masters, but also in terms of the basic threefold Zen practice of zazen, seated meditation, of samu and angya, or meditative work and pilgrimages, and third, sanzen, or interviews with a Zen master. In the silence and stillness of zazen, one experientially embodies the emptiness of letting everything go. In daily work, samu, or on the path of pilgrimage, angya, one non-dually enters into and learns from the natural way of things. And in the face-to-face interviews with the teacher, sanzen, one learns how to engage in the not one and not two betweenness of interpersonal encounter. Moreover, Ueda does not restrict this movement through ego abandonment towards reaffirmation of nature and community to the institutional practice of Zen. For example, he suggests that it is not just in formal meditation, but also the simple everyday act of breathing, in and out, which can be experienced as an exhaustive exhalation of the ego and a reaffirmative inhalation of the open expanse of the world. So in other words, it's open to all as long as you're a breathing being. This path of transmysticism is open to everyone who can breathe in and out. Breathing out, I let go of my attachment to my ego and its self-centered environs. Breathing in, I affirm the non-dual unity of my true self and the encompassing world. Ueda also frequently uses the everyday Japanese greeting of the bow, or the ojigi, as an example to illustrate how mutual self-negation, the emptying of all ego-centered presumptions and agendas, returns one to the openness of a radical nothingness that we share in common beneath the roots of our personal being. When one sincerely bows, is now quoting from Ueda, by way of making oneself into a nothingness, one returns into the infinite depths of that between where there is neither I nor you. Then, when we rise again, so as to come back to life anew and face one another, this becomes a matter of, as Dogen puts it, thus am I, thus are you. Rising up together, out of nowhere, I do not greet you as either a friend or a foe of my ego, nor even as a fellow child of God, but rather just such as you are. With such models and suggestions drawn from the daily routine of Zen monks and the customary greeting of the Japanese, the task for us would be to find and establish in our own lives an everyday practice of transmysticism. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brett, for this very interesting talk. I think it contributes a lot to the conference. We've been talking a lot about Eckhart, and this talk really brings it into comparative perspective and allows us to get perspective on Neoplatonism from the side of the Kyoto School. So this is, I think, a real contribution. We have time for some questions. So maybe we start out with Ian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brett. Um, I really like what you say about demysticism, and I largely agree with the reading of Eckhart. There's one moment or a couple of moments I want to focus on in which I see more of a parallel. Before I do that, let me make one comment about transdescendence. I'm wondering, is that a term that Ueda picked up from the European tradition and then used in Japanese, or is it scholars trying to understand his Japanese term using the term transdescendence? And I say that because, as far as I know, Jean Val coined the term transdescendence to talk about transcendence transcended toward immanence in 1937 in a lecture called Subjectivity and Transcendence. That was very influential on Levinas, Gabriel Marcel, among others. Um, so maybe you can answer that. But I'll ask my question about Eckhart first. If I take my model, not so much Martha, or not even the claim in the poverty sermon that I should give up God for the sake of God, but rather really emphasizing the without why, and then in particular a sermon on the three deaths of the soul, which is maybe pseudo Eckhartian, but I'm sure Ueda would have known it because it was fairly well cited back in the German literature back in the day, even though it's not as well known now. And there Eckhart talks about dying to God in various ways. And the final stage is the soul going her own way. She loses her quest for God. She just abandons God and she just goes her own way and wanders. And so I guess I'm wondering about focusing on moments like that to try to see more parallels. I guess rather than saying there's always this theocentric perspective or ontotheological perspective or substantialist perspective, as I heard you kind of going toward more toward the end of your talk. So I'm wondering how you read those more radical moments in Eckhart that don't seem to be theocentric anymore.
Yeah, thank you. So your mic is on, right? Yeah, yeah. To your first question. So yes, the Eckhart, Ueda is not the first. It was Nishitani that he really draws that phrase, transdescendence. And in fact, to be honest, I think I'm taking it from Nishitani and applying it to Eckhart here. I'm sorry, to Ueda here, as opposed to taking that from Ueda himself. And I'm using it in the way that Nishitani uses it. However, other previous Kyoto school thinkers, and also after Nishitani, I'm thinking of Takeuchi Yoshinori in particular, use that phrase in a different way. And so in the Kyoto school, there's Zen thinkers and there's Pure Land Buddhist thinkers, and they often kind of cross, from the get-go, because Nishida was primarily Zen, but also deeply interested in Pure Land Buddhism, and so they're always kind of going back and forth. But there's predominantly Zen thinkers. Ueda is certainly predominantly a Zen thinker, does not refer to Pure Land Buddhism much. Nishitani is a predominantly Zen thinker, but especially later in life, he deals a lot more with Pure Land Buddhism as well. And so the way it's interesting to see the way in which that term is taken up and then used differently by the primarily Zen thinkers and the primarily Pure Land Buddhist thinkers. And Takeuchi is one that would use, he knows the lecture you're speaking of, and he draws the term from there and applies it, but reinterprets it in his own way, right? So definitely they're sort of doing their own thing with the term. And Nishitani's use of the term is actually not in the original Japanese of Shukyo to Nanika, the book that gets translated as Religion and Nothingness by Jan van Bracht. But it was in the process, Van Bracht went over the translation with Nishitani, and Nishitani made some revisions to the English. So that term, transdescendence, appears in the English edition of a version of Religion and Nothingness, but not in the original Japanese. But by that point, Nishitani is very much using the phrase in his own way. And so I think it would be an interesting, and I hope you'll do it, or maybe I should do it, or maybe we should do it together, an interesting comparative endeavor to now go back and see the way that Jean Val used that term, see the way that then it was picked up by Levinas and others, as you mentioned. Levinas also speaks of transcendence, so I think he's going in the other direction. And then to compare it to the various ways in which the Kyoto school thinkers are using that term. So it's a kind of floating signifier in that way. It's sort of like, saying if you use the word God, everybody's using that in the same way. No, so transcendence is certainly a term you'd want to let people define in their own ways. And in this paper, what I'm doing is I'm taking it from Nishitani and applying it to Ueda. All right, that was a long answer to your short first question. The second question, the more difficult and the more important question. Yes, I will have to go and look at this sermon that you're talking about, the 3 deaths of the soul, and think about that. But I guess my sense is that, especially in a short paper like this, it comes out sounding, you want to be clear as possible, and it comes out sounding very kind of schematic, and then as if kind of Ueda has this schema from the beginning and this agenda. And it's not quite the case. I mean, he's deeply interested in Eckhart, and he's going with Eckhart kind of as far as he can. But then he finds himself, again and again in Eckhart's text, finding these moments where he wants to go in this other direction. And so on the whole, whether my own inclination is to not think that there is one essential teaching that is Eckhart, right? We have a proper name that we then think there's this one essential teaching, but rather to explore the different vectors and the different pathways opened up in his sermons, as opposed to the Latin works, which are very different. And rather than trying, of course, we want to try to see, well, can these all hang together? But at a certain point, we might want to say no. Like, there are certain sermons where he's going in a really radical direction that might, as you indicate, be much closer to Zen, even than maybe Ueda is allowing for. But then there's plenty of other vectors where this is why it's all too easy for more conservative Christian theologians to bring him back into the fold, so to speak. So I would be more interested in not getting into a battle over what this signifier Eckhart means, but rather really looking at the text and seeing what avenues are opened up and which tend to predominate, but there are ones that kind of escape the orbit of the theocentrism, as you put it. Does that respond to your question?
Certainly, that's nice. I agree. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think those various trajectories in the text have also colored our conversations, and the different responses, the different readings that we've exchanged in the discussions, I think, in part indicate a divergence in the text itself. So that's also helpful. I'm glad that you were able to point that out. That's very helpful, actually. Elizabeth, maybe we have about 5 minutes before we need to take a break. So floor is yours.
Okay, so just quickly, so I had a question actually about the Mary and Martha sermon, and it's a question about the extent. I want to read. By the way, thanks for your talk. Really learned a lot. Loved it. And I want to read Martha in a way that you were, as somebody who's living without a why, and the kind of overall way in which I was thinking about her as kind of joining together the contemplative and the active life sort of squares with that very beautifully. But as I mentioned before, it seems like there are these passages in that sermon where Eckhart sort of qualifies that, or he resists that kind of reading of Martha, I think. So for example, the passage where it says, Martha was so grounded in being that her activity did not hinder her. Work and activity led her to eternal happiness. Then he goes on to say, granted, her happiness was somewhat impaired by mediation, but her noble nature and constant striving and the aforementioned virtue stirred her well. And also when he talks about her at the very beginning of the sermon, her experience and so on, he says like there's a certain way in which, we can gain a lot from experience of the world, even more so just from what eternal light gives us knowledge of, and the sort of knowledge of self and God and so on. But it's always this like kind of like to a certain extent. It feels like when I'm reading the sermon, he's like hesitant to want to say that Martha has already kind of done the breakthrough and is done the transmystical move. So I wondered what you think of that. I mean, does either Ueda talk about that, or have you noticed this aspect of kind of this qualification of Martha, or is it perhaps because Eckhart has this tendency to want to stay in this, remain with one in the one, and to the extent that Martha is now kind of moving out, there's like a diminishment. I don't know how to read these qualifications. I'm just wondering what you think of that, or if you don't see that as those as qualifications actually, and then there's another way to read them.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And now, I have to go back and open the text and have it in front of me and reread it with that in mind. But even just the quotes that you gave, I think were really helpful. And also, just to repeat back what you said to you, that I agree with is the questions, right? How do we understand that hesitancy? Is it a critique of Martha, like she's not quite there yet, where Eckhart is trying to push her and us and himself, or is it Eckhart's own hesitancy, as you put it, right? And I think that's a really interesting question of interpretation. And I think we also have to do work on chronology as well, right? Because Eckhart is saying different things in different periods. It's not just the difference between the Latin works and the sermons, but the sermons themselves. And to see, is there a movement where he becomes more radical? Does he, does he go back and forth between more radical sermons and less? And then where to situate this particular, the Mary and Martha's sermon in all that, and how does it square with other texts? Right. But that's great. You give me a lot to sort of go back with that phrase, so grounded in being that activity did not hinder her. Definitely sounds like this. These,
right?
Yeah. That's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for that. But Ueda, let me just say, maybe Ueda. It's exciting reading Ueda. If you get a chance to read, start with this. This is his first book. It's his dissertation he's writing in Marburg. Yeah. And it's just fascinating because he's not there so he had already been deeply, practicing Zen and whatnot, but he's not there to give like a Zen critique or even a Zen interpretation. He writes later, I saw it in hindsight, but I didn't even realize that I was giving a Zen interpretation at all. I was just trying to understand Eckhart, and I was just really drawn into his thought. And he sort of found a way with the birth motif and the breakthrough motif to really organize, this, to lay out the thought in a really clear and fascinating way. And then it was after his dissertation was finished, and in Europe they usually publish it as a book, that his advisor said, you really pushed him and said, you really need to write something about Zen here, because we know nothing about that, and you're here, this precious chance we have, put them in. And it was then that Ueda sat down, and that was the first thing he ever wrote about Zen. So he'd been practicing Zen, right? But this was something he was living, not writing about. It was not an object of research yet for him. And so this was this kind of, moment for him. You can even feel it, in this text that Greg translated. You can feel him working it out. It's like, oh, wait a minute. It almost it feels like, oh, wait a minute. They're not as close as I thought. It's almost like, you felt like when he was reading Eckhart, he was just like, oh, this is great. I don't even need Zen. I just like Eckhart. This is it, But then when he goes to compare them, he's like, no, wait a minute. There's something like this thrust towards what I'm calling transmissive, or he calls non-mysticism, transmissive. He's like, that goes even farther in Zen. And the reason I was following that thrust in Eckhart is because that's where I'm coming from. I'm coming from this tradition that okay, come on, you're almost there. You're almost at the point where you're not just letting go of God, but killing the Buddha, right? I mean, that's, an even stronger sort of statement. So it's in the process that Ueda himself realizes where he's coming from, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then he goes on for 40 50 more maybe 50, at least 50 more years of writing, and he's translating Eckhart into Japanese. So he's an Eckhart scholar lifelong, but he's writing then on increasingly kind of more self-consciously and self-confidently from the standpoint of Zen, as his career goes on.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Well, thanks so much for your talk again. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So let me thank you one more time for coming and giving the talk. And I think we'll take a short break and we'll come back at 11:05. So Sean Hannon will speak on Eckhart and Kuza, I think. Or no, Kuza and Augustine. Kuza and Augustine. Okay. Okay, so see you all soon. Thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Brett. I still haven't read your book, Sean, but I do plan to read it. Well, you have many books, but the more recent one, but I think it's the more recent one with your co-author on mysticism. Yeah, this one. Yeah, it's like you can put it real close so everyone on YouTube can see it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Mysticism and Materialism in the Wake of German Idealism. Right. Yeah. It's on my reading list. So
Yeah, thanks for saying that. We actually dig into the Mary versus Martha in Luke 10 as read through Eckhart thing and how that plays out in terms of activity or even what Eckhart will call temporal work sometimes. But we focus on a few other possible sort of connections and ask a few questions about what it would actually take to kind of set up a situation where the active contemplative distinction could be overcome like that. So I kind of wish I was presenting on that, but instead I'm going to talk about time, and maybe we can find some sort of way of combining the conversations.
well, maybe it's just a good opportunity for people to read your book, and they can seek out the discussions of Mary and Martha in there. I don't know how big a readership there will be, but there are a few of us here in this group that
Not
are
a bestseller yet. It's not a bestseller.
Yeah, that's always a problem with philosophy books. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. It's 11:05. We're running just a tad late. Okay, so our next speaker is Sean Hannon. He's associate professor in the humanities at McEwen University. He's recently published a book. We were just talking about it with Ezekiel Gogin. I hope I didn't mispronounce his name. Entitled Mysticism and Materialism. There it is, in the Wake of German Idealism. He has a lot of interest from mysticism to Cusa, Augustine, philosophy of religion. I think you also have a book that recently, either it's coming out or it came on Augustine, right? With Bloomsbury. Is this right? Yeah. So
yeah, that was my first book in 2020. Augustine on it has more to do with the topic of time we're discussing today. It's called On Time, Change, History, and Conversion.
Wonderful. So the talk today is the temporality of truth and contradiction in Augustine and Nicholas of Cusa. So thanks a lot for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Greg, and to everyone else who's put in so much work to make this conference a success. I've learned so much from it already, it just seems like a great event. So kudos to you for putting it on. All right. For Augustine, eternity is the mark of truth. Time is the field of contradiction. The temporal world confronts us with nothing but counterfeits. On the level of moral truth, we can observe that vices often appear virtuous, while sometimes virtue comes to us cloaked in apparent vice. And even on the level of the philosophy of time proper, we can sense, along with Augustine in Confessions 11, that the present moment itself is a counterfeit. Far from being a proper now or instant, it turns out to itself be a site of contradiction, namely between the influx of the future and the efflux of the past, the quasi-simultaneous arrival of what is to come, and evacuation of what just was. Only a truly timeless aeternitas would supersede the temporal flux of contradictions and replace it with the fixed clarity of veritas. For Nicholas of Cusa, however, eternity may be the non-place, or perhaps better the non-time, where contradictories coincide, frustrating conventional notions of truth. In the eternal wall of paradise, previously mentioned at this very conference, the coincidentia oppositorum is to be found. Citing works of Cusanus like De Visione Dei, Donald Duclos has argued that this figurative wall symbolizes the limit situation of thinking, positioned somewhere between the temporal finitude of humankind and the infinity of the divine. Similarly, Cyril Origen has framed Cusanus as an avatar of a mode of transdianoetic knowing that would take human thought beyond the confines of the principle of non-contradiction. Adopting Origen's language, we could ask, would transdianoetic ways of thinking require a trans-temporal way of being? I think this could probably also be connected to the Kyoto school and the thought of Nishida Kitaro. I don't know that much about it. I want to learn more about it, especially going into next year, but I think there's work that continues to be done on Cusanus's connection specifically to that way of thinking. and even more specifically, how ideas of contradictory self-identity relate to ideas of an eternal now or an absolute present. But I don't know enough about that to talk about it right now, but it's the kind of thing I'd love to present on in future years once I educate myself and get educated by others a little bit more. To summarize the millennium of Platonic and peripatetic philosophy between Augustine and Cusanus would, of course, be impossible. All we can hope to do here is sketch out some of the key points of contrast and connection between Augustine's and Cusanus's ways of relating truth to timelessness. Both of their approaches can still be termed Neo-Platonic, I would contend. It's simply that we must expand our sense of what can count as a Neo-Platonic attitude toward time, eternity, contradiction, and non-contradiction, so that it can contain the divergent perspectives of these two load-bearing pillars in the architecture of Christian Neoplatonism. Part 1, Immaterial Truth in Confession 7. Augustine confronts the paradoxes of time and truth in countless of his works, from the early Cassiciacum dialogues down through the De Trinitate, all the way to the very late anti-Pelagian treatises. Predestination as a doctrinal position is not, it turns out, theoretically severed from a proper understanding of time and eternity. For our purposes today, it should be enough to take a few quick glances at books 7 and 11 of the Confessions. The former details Augustine's transition from a post-Manichaean materialist skepticism to a Platonic embrace of certain truth in the mold of Plotinus, Porphyry, and Marius Victorinus. The latter then delves more explicitly into the problem of temporality, though without leaving truth behind. Augustine begins Confession 7 by attacking the threat of materialism head-on. Now, we must recall that his own materialist tendencies arose from a combination of common sense closed-mindedness, if it isn't real, it isn't real if I can't see, smell, hear, taste, or touch it, and specifically Manichaean ideas about the nature of matter itself, which were unsurprisingly a tad more idiosyncratic than that. For the Manichaeans, and here I'm leaning on the work of Thomas Clemens, Nicholas Baker Bryan, and Jason Badoon, the matter that makes up most of the world was a problem. Although that world itself, even the material world, as a semi-rational ordering of raw matter, can also play a positive role in long-term salvation history, since it is through that world that we, or rather the light in us, ascends back up to the realm of the Father of Light. Astral bodies, like the moon or the Milky Way, performed vital duties in this process. But despite their celestial nature, they too remained bodies in a certain sense. It was just that they were made up of a higher quotient of light, that is, the right kind of matter. Those little particle sparks that, if we were lucky, we could find even within ourselves. The journey back to the divine was, for the Manichaeans, therefore, the flight of the light back to the light. This light was fundamentally unlike the dark matter that makes up, say, our fleshly bodies, but it could still be pictured as a kind of matter or quasi-matter. I'll try not to editorialize too much as I go, but just as an aside, I think thinking about Augustine and Manichaeism this way helps us understand how, at one and the same time, he accuses Manichaeism of being too negative about matter, and then at the same time accuses the Manichaeans of being unable to think outside of matter, which when I was first reading Augustine as a student, I found really confusing. But I think if you think about it in the way that I just framed it, it makes a little more sense. Truth, truth was the cry of the Manichaeans as they spread these teachings around the young Augustine's North Africa. By Confession 7, however, Augustine had already, at least internally, abandoned Manichaean truth claims, not necessarily in favor of some stronger truth claims, but rather in favor of the notion that perhaps no truth claims at all could be systematically defended. He was led into this vein of academic skepticism by his sense that even his learned Manichaean allies could not really make sense of their own views. Even in the case of matter, everything seemed jumbled. Matter was evil on the one hand, and yet the celestial architecture of the material cosmos could still save us. The realm of light was radically unlike this material world here below, and yet light too could be spoken of as divisible into particles that could get scattered and then brought together again at Mani's eschaton. We should not presuppose, therefore, that the materialist limits placed on Augustine's theological imagination led him to, say, anthropomorphism. It was not that he was thinking of God as having, apart from the incarnation, of course, a human-shaped body, but that he couldn't imagine anything real or true that was properly bodiless. And here I quote from the Bolding translation of the Confessions, although it's always profitable, especially when dealing with complicated statements about truth and time, to consult multiple versions of Augustine, and if there's time, come up with your own Latin translations. Quote, even though I was no longer hampered by the image of a human body, I was still forced to imagine something corporeal spread out in space, whether infused into the world or even diffused through the infinite outside it. This was still the case, even though I recognized that this substance was imperishable, inviolable, and immutable, necessarily so, being superior to anything perishable, subject to violation, or changeable. Because anything to which I must deny these spatial dimensions seemed to me to be nothing at all, absolutely nothing, not even a void such as might be left if every kind of body, earthly, watery, aerial, or heavenly, were removed from it. For though such a place would be a nothingness, it would still have the quality of space. I'll note here that the Pilkington translation from the old and musty Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers series ends that last sentence by having Augustine dub what he has in mind a kind of, quote, spacious nothing, as it were. And that's a mellifluous turn of phrase, and I think it nicely captures Augustine's Latin, tamquam spatiosum nihil. Given his Manichaean predilections, we ought to envision Augustine imagining something like a vast expanse of light, a vision worthy of the Father of light. And yet, this august vision would still be reducible to the dimensions of spatial extension. Even an apparently infinite expanse of light, in other words, would still be an expanse, and therefore a determinate something rather than a true infinite. Upon reading the books of the Platonists, however, Augustine was awakened to the ideas that there can be realities not made of matter, and that truth itself may in fact need to be understood apart from the material matrices within which we assign propositions about this or that state of affairs being true or untrue. Adapting and altering the Manichaean rhetoric of light, Augustine rhapsodizes during his failed note, to meditate his way up to a kind of Neo-Platonic ecstasy. Quote, anyone who knows truth knows the light, and whoever knows it knows eternity. Love knows it. O eternal truth, true love, and beloved eternity, you are my God, end quote. I'm thinking here now of Eric's talk from the other day. He continues, quote, I said, is truth then a nothing simply because it is not spread out through space, either finite or infinite? Then from afar you cried to me, by no means, for I am who am, end quote. Giving explicit credit to the aforementioned Platonists, Augustine adds, quote, after reading the books of the Platonists and following their advice to seek for truth beyond corporeal forms, I turned my gaze toward your invisible reality, trying to understand it through created things, Romans 1:20. And though I was rebuffed, I did perceive what that reality was, which the darkness of my soul would not permit me to contemplate. I was certain that you exist, that you are infinite, but not spread out through space, either finite or infinite, and that you exist in the fullest sense because you have always been the same, unwavering in every respect and in no wise subject to change, end quote. But this incorporeal truth Augustine finds via the Platonists is, he says, not truly described or properly appreciated by the Platonists, since they miss out on the foolishness that confounds Greek wisdom, namely the scandal of the incarnation. When the Son becomes incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, argues Augustine already in Confession 7, it is not merely some vague divine hypostasis that takes on sarx, it is truth itself that gets infleshed. And this truth must be eternal. Quote, your word, the eternal truth who towers above the higher spheres of your creation, raises up to himself those creatures who bow before him. But in these lower regions, he has built himself a humble dwelling from our clay and used it to cast down from their pretentious selves those who do not bow before him and to make a bridge to bring them to himself, end quote. Harkening back to John 14:6, Augustine finds a suitable proof text for his identification of Christ with Veritas. I am the way, says Jesus there, and the truth and the life. Earlier, I spoke of a Manichaean eschaton, but maybe that isn't quite right. The Latin Manichaeans, at least, spoke instead of the three times, the tria tempora. First came the time of pure separation. Light was light and darkness was darkness. Then came the invasion of the kingdom of light by the forces of darkness, resulting in the interim saeculum, the intermediate age of the world. this is where or when we live, constituted by ongoing warfare between the two sides, with the scales of battle being tipped by Jesus' divine mission to rescue the sparks trapped in the night. It will be a long stretch of time, perhaps requiring many cycles of reincarnation, before Jesus' rescue mission will reach its culmination, after which we'll enter into the third time, a time of renewed separation between light and darkness, with both sides enduring in their proper place. Part 2, Timeless Truth in Confessions 11. In Book 11 of the Confessions, Augustine too speaks of tria tempora, 3 times. Some would go so far as to say that we should rethink his entire account of temporality in light of this terminological resonance. My own sense is that the resonance is a real one, and that Augustine does want us to keep Mani's approach to temporality in mind as he unveils his own thoughts on the subject. It is likely, after all, that his unnamed interlocutor, the one who asks annoying questions like, what was God doing before God created the world, so on, is meant to represent a common Manichaean refrain. But there are other depths of meaning to the phrase tria tempora, such as the 3 tenses of time, past, present, and future, which Augustine clearly also has in mind. Ultimately, Augustine is mobilizing language meant to skewer the Manichaeans in order to simultaneously make a much broader series of points about the nature of time itself. I have written elsewhere of what I take to be one of the trickiest, yet most decisive points made in Confessions 11, which is that the present non habet spatium. It has no span, and therefore cannot be a substantive phase or moment in the time stream, as if such a stream could be reducible to a series of moments in the first place. Instead, it must be thought of either as nothing at all, if we want to think of Augustine as a radical anti-presentist, or less dramatically, as a notional punctum or an Aristotelian paros, a limit point that we conceptually project onto the continuum, Aristotle calls it a synechia, that the time stream is. This might be an example of another thing Eric was talking about in his lecture, which is when Augustine accidentally becomes Aristotelian, even though he probably had no idea that's what he was doing. This critique or even negation of the idea of a present moment is one of Augustine's most significant contributions to the late ancient philosophy of time, pushing back against momentariness in Stoicism and maybe also Epicureanism, and even taking a step beyond Plotinus's account of temporality in the 7th treatise of the 3rd Ennead, which is less explicitly concerned with the problem of the present and more explicitly concerned with the proper framing of the aion as timeless eternity. What I want to focus on instead of the present is, in fact, the sense of aeternitas Augustine himself develops in Confessions 11, which is much more directly in conversation with what Plotinus is up to, and which is therefore more appropriate for a conference on the history of various Platonisms. For his part, Augustine juxtaposes the pure stasis of eternity to the dynamic flow of negations, the past as a no longer, the present as a non-space, the future as a not yet, that constitutes time. While the Greek aion of Plotinus retained extreme semantic flexibility, often being used in a sense closer to the Latin saeculum, which Augustine also uses a lot, than to Augustine's aeternitas, this Augustinian eternity was not simply an age or ages upon ages or even the longest possible extent of time. It was, on the contrary, the absence of age, ages, or any kind of time whatsoever. One of the ideas Augustine was pushing back against here was that divine eternity could be reduced to something like duration, even if it was infinite duration we had in mind. The ambiguity is arguably already contained in the Greek apeiron, that which has no paras or limit, which could mean a continuum or synechia, running on infinitely, both into the past and into the future, or B, something that has no limit and cannot in any way be limited precisely because it is neither a continuum nor a synechia. The former definition of the eternal as infinite crops up again and again in varied philosophical contexts, ancient, medieval, and modern, whereas the latter definition of the eternal as infinite is closer to Augustine's own apparent meaning. Eternity is infinite not because it is an endless continuum running on in both directions, but because it simply isn't a continuum at all. This insight feeds back into Augustine's rejoinder to the Manichaeans, which is presumably a more pressing concern in his context than is attaining a proper understanding of the finer shades of the apeiron. The tria tempora of Mani makes sense only if we are limited to thinking in terms of duration. The first time is an enduring period in which light is separated from darkness. The second time is a limited duration in which the battle is fought. And the third time is a lasting peace. The character of duration does not disappear if we maximize or infinitize the three times. Even if the first time expands infinitely backward, with the Father of Light enduring forever rather than flicking on ex nihilo, or the third time extends infinitely forward, with once dimmed sparks growing ever brighter alongside their Father, kind of Manichaean epictasis maybe, we are still talking about infinite durations, not an infinite eternity that would be irreducible to duration. For Augustine, however, the relationship between the divine and the human does not play out in accordance with Mani's three times. Instead, there is only one time, tempus itself, the flux in which we live between the ex nihilo flashpoint of creation and the singular eschatological end towards which all things tend. But this field of time in which we live our lives is not the sole repository of the real or the true. In fact, as the Platonists taught Augustine back in Book 7, the truest things are those grounded outside of time. The field of time is the field of contradictions, wherein what is true today may not be true tomorrow. In Confession 7, tellingly, Augustine's most blatant example of this is his flirtation with and subsequent rejection of astrology. But when we encounter veritas, truth itself, the guarantor of verum, or that which is true, we can no longer escape the conclusion that some truths hold regardless of any temporal conditions. Mathematical truth is the classic gateway drug here, and Augustine is not immune. So I think the 7 + 3 = 10 also came up already, and we're going back to that again. A little before Book 6 finds Augustine confessing that his goal was to become as certain about immaterial truth in general as he was about timeless mathematical truths specifically. Quote, "I long to become as certain of those things I could not see as I was that 7 and 3 make 10. I was not so demented as to think that even this simple truth was beyond comprehension, but I wanted to have the same grasp of other things, both material entities not immediately present to my senses, and spiritual realities of which I did not know how to think in any but a materialistic way. The possibility of healing was, ironically, within my reach, if only I had been willing to believe, because then I could, with a more purified mind, have focused my gaze on your truth, which abides forever and is deficient in nothing." End quote. His mathematical mantra, 7 and 3 make 10, is numerological. It gestures further back to Book 3, where we see Augustine in full thrall to the Manichaeans and, at the same time, to the three concupiscentiae, the triple lusts of the flesh, of the eye, and of worldly ambition. The 10 to which the 7 and the 3 add up are the 10 Commandments. An evil life, says Augustine, is one lived, quote, "in opposition to that other 3 + 7, the 10-stringed harp, your Decalogue, O God most high and most sweet," end quote. In Confessions 11, however, the timeless truth Augustine encounters is not the Pythagorean theorem or even 3 + 7 = 10, but rather the veritas that became incarnate as Christ. Multiple times in Book 11, he ascribes statements made by Jesus in the New Testament simply to the truth. Elsewhere in the same book, he imagines himself getting a chance to interrogate Moses about the truth status of Genesis 1, the cosmogonic context for Augustine's investigation into time and eternity in the first place. They couldn't speak the same languages, Augustine acknowledges, and yet, even still, veritas itself would enable Augustine to judge Moses to be a truth teller. Quote, "Within myself, in that inner habitation of my thought, the truth that is neither Hebrew nor Greek nor Latin nor any vernacular would speak to me without bodily organ of mouth or tongue, and without any clatter of syllables would tell me, Moses is speaking the truth. And then with instant certainty, I would say to that man who served you, namely Moses, what you say is true. But since I cannot question him who spoke truthfully because you, O truth, had filled him, I beg you yourself, O truth, my God, to pardon my sins. And as you granted that servant of yours the grace to say those things, grant also to me the grace to understand them." End quote. Augustine adds that the inner meaning of Genesis 1 must be understood through the word or the truth as it speaks in the gospel. In the beginning makes sense only in light of in the beginning was the word. as Augustine explains, quote, "This eternal reason is your word, who is the beginning, in that he also speaks to us." The gospel records that he claimed this by word of mouth, making his claim audible to people's outward ears, that they might believe him and seek him within themselves and find him in the eternal truth, where he, our sole teacher, instructs apt disciples. "There it is that I hear your voice, O Lord, the voice of one who speaks to me. Because anyone who truly teaches us speaks to us directly, whereas one who is no true teacher does not speak to us, though speak he may. After all, can anyone teach us other than stable, immutable truth? Even when some changeable creature advises us, we are but led to that stable truth, where we truly learn as we stand still and listen." End quote. Augustine's encounter with timeless truth is not then an idle moment of contemplation in which he glimpses off in the distance some remote citadel in which all the truths of mathematics and such are concealed. It is a living encounter with the immaterial become material and the timeless become temporal. It is a living encounter with Jesus as truth. Augustine personalizes or hypostatizes eternal veritas as Christ. Augustine's philosophical account of time and eternity in Book 11 therefore turns out, when looked at from an altered vantage point, to be laying the foundations for an alternative salvation history capable of countering his erstwhile Manichaean friends. Both he and the followers of Mani make Jesus the central point around which cosmic time pivots, but they don't do so in the same way. For the Manichaeans, Jesus' preaching of the gospel of light signals that the long, complex series of steps involved in defeating the darkness are finally reaching the point where we can say that the pendulum is swinging in favor of the Father. Jesus is therefore, from Mani's point of view, one of the most important temporal entities ever to exist. For Augustine in Confessions 11, however, Jesus is the incarnation of timeless eternity in time, the eruption of truth out of a field of contradictions. The result is a paradox, though a fruitful one, to be hypostatically harvested, some would say, at Chalcedon 21 years after Augustine's death. I'd like to end this section by positing a parallel between the philosophical transformations Augustine undergoes in Book 7 and Book 11 of his Confessions. In Book 7, I suggested materialism was Augustine's problem. Unable to think of anything real beyond what was extended in space, he could only locate truth within the confines of spatial extension. And worse, he could only picture God as the maximum of spatial extension. In Book 11, meanwhile, the problem is no longer materialism, since the author had long before been convinced of the reality of immaterial truth by Plotinus and Porphyry. Instead, the problem becomes one of, if I can risk a potential neologism, durationism. Someone's probably already come up with that word before, but I might be using it in a slightly different way. Paralleling materialism, durationism would amount to the inability to think of the real or the true beyond the realm of temporal extension. Right? So temporal instead of spatial extension. The culminating absurdity here would be to be unable to conceive of God as anything other than the maximum of temporal extension, even if that maximization equated to infinite duration. That is to say, Augustine is pushing back against the tendency to slide from a strictly static sense of timeless aeternitas back into the quasi-eternity of an infinite duration, an intellectual crime which the Manichaeans are far from alone in committing. Such backsliding sometimes takes the form of equivocation, such as when we simply don't care to properly distinguish between atemporality and the merely everlasting. There might admittedly be an intermediate term between true timelessness and infinite duration. Maybe there's many intermediate terms, I don't know. We could dub this term omnitemporality or omnitemporality and associate it with the aforementioned truths of mathematics. Taking this position, we could claim that mathematical truths can be said to hold or obtain at any time, without thereby committing ourselves either to the claim that mathematical truths are as timeless as God, or to the claim that mathematical truths simply persist everlastingly throughout time, but would then lose their applicability if the flux were to halt, or something like that. Augustine's approach in Book 11 tends not to agonize much over this middle term. For now, he is happy to juxtapose timeless eternity to the time stream, thereby curing the ill of durationism, just as he had broken free of the chains of materialism. Part 3, non-temporal time at Cusanus's Wall of Paradise. There were other Platonists, both ancient and medieval, who did dabble in that interstitial space between aeternitas and unbounded duration. It would be impossible to say much more about the relationship between Augustine and Cusanus without paying at least some slight attention to the non-Christian Platonists of late antiquity, especially Iamblichus and Proclus. Here I ought to lean upon the work of one of my co-presenters at this event, our keynote speaker, Elizabeth Bryant, who has done so much to systematically track the development of the philosophy of time within the Neoplatonic tradition. As Bryant has amply demonstrated, these intervening Platonists explored a concept that we ought to call, instead of omnitemporality, absolute or even non-temporal time. Such a concept would also have the benefit, if indeed it is a benefit, of potentially connecting up with modern philosophical and esoteric notions of an absolute temporality between time and eternity, as in the true time of the unknown philosopher, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, and the Martinist adjacent, Franz Xaver von Baader, the sometimes friend of Schelling and Hegel. And that is in the recent book, if anyone wants to dig deeper into that weird stuff. But what does it mean to speak of a non-temporal time? Augustine's own approach could be accused of simplifying the time-eternity relationship down to a crude dichotomy, though it remains a legible dichotomy in its defense. When we wander into non-temporal time, conversely, it feels like we might be hurling ourselves all too willfully into the realm of pure paradox. Bryant, however, has done us the service of explaining the role that is meant to be played by this absolute form of temporality. Iamblichus, the theurgy-loving student of Porphyry, described the intermediary between timelessness and time as being structured in a static order of earlier and later. That is to say, absolute temporality was not truly detached from the distinction between earlier and later, nor was it itself something that unfolded as earlier gave way to later. Instead, it was the non-time-bound ordering principle by which alone we time-bound beings could become capable of positing for ourselves the distinction between what arrives earlier and what comes later. Likewise, Proclus in the 5th century CE seems to have thought that if there is any sense at all in which chronos can be ascribed to the nous or intellect, the second of Plotinus's 3 hypostases, it could only be an absolute or non-relative temporality. Proclus's account of this in-between quasi-time is meant to explain not just how it is that our minds can organize time into categories, like past, present, and future, but also how time mirrors or images eternity, as Plotinus had argued on the basis of his reading of Plato's Timaeus 37d, usually rendered as something like, time is an image of eternity moving in accordance with number, or time is an image of the aion, incredibly ambiguous and philosophically flexible term, moving in accordance with number. Bryant describes Proclus ascribing 3 powers to the mind: the perfective, the cohesive, and the revelatory powers, all 3 of which are co-present in absolute time as a whole, but are divided up in the time of the soul, where temporal entities participate each separately as past perfective, present cohesive, and future revelatory. Further, says Bryant, this triadic structure of absolute time is itself an image of the triadic structure of eternity. Insofar as these Iamblician and Proclean theories about the time between time and eternity were taken up into medieval Latin Christian thought, thanks to the Dionysian, Ariogenian, and Arabic language philosophical traditions, among others, they continued to influence thinking about temporality in the 15th century. In the case of Nicholas of Cusa, we can spy such influence in his statements suggesting that we need to posit something like non-temporal time in order to make sense of both time and eternity. To quote again from Bryant, quote, like Iamblichus and Proclus before him, Cusanus posits a primary intellectual time situated between the absolute unity of divine eternity and the temporal unfolding of created things in nature. But whereas Iamblichus and Proclus had conceived of this primal intellectual time as an independent formal principle, an intermediary between the divine one and the cosmos, Cusanus understands intellectual time to be a form of the human mind itself. The human mind, Cusanus writes, recognizes itself as non-temporal intellectual time, end quote. On this reading, Cusanus spins the post-Platonian Platonic account of time found in Iamblichus and Proclus into a philosophy of mind worthy of near-contemporary Renaissance humanists like Ficino or Pico. It is not simply that the nous, as the second of the three primary hypostases, contains within itself a static ordering principle that happens to govern dynamic relationships between temporal entities. Instead, it's the human mind, as imago Dei in the most robust sense, as the microcosm of the great macrocosm, that encounters its own ability to transcend temporality and escape from its apparent time-boundedness, maybe even within this life, under the right cognitive conditions, presumably. Perhaps it is this ability of the human mind to touch the absolute that enables us to think our way up to what Cusanus calls the walls of paradise, where the poles of any contradiction can be found to coincide. With reference to the treatise De Conjecturis, Duclos has clarified for us that the Cusan itinerary to God leads through, but also beyond, the coincidentia oppositorum. Quote, far from abandoning dialectic, Nicholas simply distinguishes between non-contradiction and coincidence as the logics appropriate to reason and intelligence. He clarifies 3 points. 1, that reason's distinctions apply to finite concepts and creatures. 2, that the creature is not identical to the creator. But 3, that opposites do coincide within God. But from De Conjecturis onwards, Duclos adds, Cusanus says that God is above the coincidence of opposites, which provides a way toward the vision of God above all opposition and coincidence, end quote. Augustine's journey, we recall, had been simpler. It took him from the temporal field of contradictions to the only place or non-time where contradictions could be proven absent, the eternal stasis of divine truth. For Cusanus, the situation could never be so simple. Instead, as our minds approach the divine, we experience not so much the gradual resolving of apparent contradictions into straightforward truths, with every proposition in its proper place, as the radical co-presence of contradictories, unthinkable in terms of everyday temporal experience, maybe, but quite thinkable for a human mind able to lift itself out of the flux and onto the wall of paradise. As Duclos explains, quote, the external, finite region, by its very nature, has an end or limit, which the wall of paradise represents, and beyond which is divine infinity. Finitude, limit, and infinity thus constitute a dialectical pattern within which thinking is continually in motion. Cusanus uses the wall of paradise to illustrate this motion, saying, I go in from creatures to you, the creator, from effects to their cause. I go out from you, the creator, to creatures, from the cause to the effects. I go in and I go out simultaneously when I see that going out is going in, and that going in is simultaneously going out. In sum, says Duclos, Cusanus's wall of paradise symbolizes the limit situation of thinking. It is the fluid boundary where thinking oscillates between finite opposition and infinite unity. And in this oscillation, thinking discloses the common genesis of thinking and being in actual divine infinity, end quote. We get a little bit into oscillation in, I think it's in Novalis in the book as well, but that's where my co-author Zeke Goggin is the expert, so please don't ask me any Novalis questions. We might add here that it is in simultaneity, the simultaneity of Cusanus's simultaneously going in and going out, where poles of contradictions become co-present for Cusanus. Framed temporally, this suggests that eternity, in which all things are co-present with each other, is not merely a synonym for truth, as seemed to suffice for Augustine, but in fact the site of the coincidence of opposites. This constitutes a higher order of truth, to be sure, but also one which pushes back against conventional notions of truth as the resolution of contradictions into non-contradictory sets of veridical propositions. Duclos has further expressed this relationship between the wall of paradise and the philosophy of time by way of the image of the clock, which is especially apt given the fact that mechanical clocks counted as cutting-edge technology in the era of Cusanus. I have a piece that deals with this issue more directly in a forthcoming Festschrift for Duclos himself. Elsewhere in that essay, I have tried to build on Duclaux's concept of the Cousin clock, arguing that it too serves as a kind of non-temporal ordering principle for temporality in a manner reminiscent of non-temporal time in Bryant's reading of Iamblichus and Proclus. At the same time, we must remember that Cusanus's dissatisfaction with the simple temporality-eternity dichotomy led him to argue that God's infinity was a step beyond even that dichotomy itself. If time is the realm of Adamic exile, and eternity, as the negation of time, is the wall of paradise in which opposites coincide, then that which lies beyond the wall, paradise, cannot simply be called eternal or timeless. Its infinity must transcend even the infinity we associate with aeternitas, or the aion as apeiron. Calling back to the concept of transdianoetic thought, perhaps we ought to call it Cusanus's transfinite eternity, insofar as it is one infinity that outstrips another. To conclude, for Augustine, the problem of materialism and the constraints it places upon our senses of truth, contradiction, and the divine was at least partially resolved by an awakening to Platonic insights into the immateriality of truth itself, or that which, being timeless, makes possible our temporal judgments about the relative truth or contradiction of propositions concerning time-bound entities or states of affairs. The solution of this problem, however, only gave rise to a more perplexing problem, the question of how time, at the end of the day, relates to eternity. In answering the second question, Augustine determined that just as a notion of immaterial truth was required in order to overcome the constraints of materialism, so is a notion of strict timelessness necessary in order to free ourselves from the constraints of what I'm calling here durationism, the belief, probably unjustified, possibly untrue, that the enduring is the mark of the true. Such was the Platonism of Augustine's approach to time, truth, and contradiction. Cusanus, for his part, was just as much of a Platonist in his own approach, although his preoccupations differed from Augustine's. He was less concerned, for example, about the problem of the present, and he was less satisfied with the idea that being awakened to the truth of timeless eternity was a sufficient account of humankind's approach to the divine. When I say that he was less concerned about the problem of the present, that opens up a whole series of debates about what Cusanus says about the absolute present or mystical now, but set that aside for later. In addition, he gave much greater prominence to the role played by the human mind in its own ascent out of time by way of a strange intermediary, whatever we may wish to call it, toward not just the timeless, but that which is beyond the very distinction between time and timelessness. But where does all that leave Cusanus with regard to this issue of durationism? If, to reiterate with some modification, time or duration is the realm of exile, and the negation of time or duration, also known as timelessness, is the wall of paradise, then would that make paradise proper the negation of duration, or the reconstitution of something like duration at a higher level? At least one passage in Cusanus's Divisione Dei seems to suggest that yes, may be the answer. Infinite duration, which is eternity itself, embraces all succession, says Cusanus there. Everything that appears to us in succession in no way exists subsequent to your concept, that is God's concept, which is eternity. Citing Maurice de Gandillac, Duclos calls our attention to the equivocations in Cusanus's treatment of eternity relative to infinite duration. When the chips are down, do eternity and infinite duration become equivalent again for Cusanus? Or must eternity remain the atemporal metric by which temporal durations become measurable in the first place? Unsurprisingly, as Duclos further notes, Cusanus will introduce another distinction here, namely that between duratio absoluta and duratio successiva. Perhaps it is in the space between absolute and successive duration that the next solution to the problem of durationism will be found. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm happy that we had a talk that connects the question of contradiction and truth to time. I think that's, in a way, a central theme that we really shouldn't have skipped. So thank you for offering a paper on this question. Okay, so let's open it up for questions. Let's see if there's anything online. Okay, nothing yet. So yeah, anyone on, okay, Elizabeth, please.
Thanks so much, Sean. I learned so much from your talk. I really appreciate it. I have so many questions. Let me see. I'll choose one. Maybe just to look at the end of your paper, this issue of infinite duration and what do we make of it, and the distinction between absolute duration and successive duration. I'm wondering if you could make sense of that. If you think about it in connection with what he says about the infinite line in De Doctor Ignorantia. So, you know, the infinite line is the essence of all finite lines. So it'd be like infinite duration is the essence of all successive duration. The infinite line isn't quantitative at all, so it's not extended, right? So it's not duration in the sense of something going on and on and on and on. It has the sense of absolute kind of integrity or something. Yeah. The sense in which, you know, no matter how much you divide it, you can't, you know, still the essence of the line, you know, you can't divide the line up into points or sections or pieces of duration or something like that, right? So if you think about absolute duration as non-quantitative, the same way that, you know, that an infinite line is and is the essence of all finite lines, that it isn't extension at all, because extension is quantitative.
Right.
Maybe that helps. I don't know. I mean, that's just like a suggestion. Does that help? I guess that's the question. Does that help?
Yes, I think so.
Why not?
Yeah. Just to make sure I have the terminology right, though, should I say that infinite duration is the essence of all successive durations? Is that what you said?
I don't know.
Absolute duration
that's what I'm suggesting. That's yeah.
Essence. Okay.
Or
no,
the
that's
measure.
so mapping it onto the exile wall paradise thing. Should I say that this absolute duration is to be associated with paradise, or are we still just at the wall? Because sometimes I get confused when I'm reading too much Cusanus about whether we've broken through the gate in the wall, or maybe we're still at the gate in the wall.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
No, but that's still really helpful. I've written that down, and I'll go back to that.
We should talk. Maybe we can talk about it more. I'll think about it too. And I want to look at the passages that you're looking at.
Yes, and I'm cribbing, as you could tell, while citing a lot from the essays and Masters of Learned Ignorance. You know,
yeah.
The great Duclos collection of essays.
So great. Yeah, and I have to go back and look at that too. I mean, I'm really myself very unsure what to make of, you know, what's on the other side of this wall, or like, that's even wrong to say that, obviously, but right. You know, God unveiled, right.
It's just kind of weird to think about, you know, I'm connecting it back again to Eric Pearl's talk, right? And it could maybe I'm just overcomplicating everything, and maybe it could be boiled down to another one of those instances where Augustine just kind of does have a simpler view of all this stuff. Like, he just doesn't have that extra gear that you find, and I don't think that's not an insult, because I love Augustine and I always write on Augustine, but you do find that extra gear, I think, in some of those late ancient Neo-Platonists, and then Cusanus definitely has the extra gear, and so they're always taking those extra steps, whereas Augustine seems to he wants to take a certain number of steps, but once he gets to a place where everything kind of fits together, which for him is timeless eternity, he just seems to be a little more satisfied with kind of staying at that level. I mean, there are places where he probably sounds like there is something further, but sorry, go on.
I want to plug like just like a sort of slightly, he gets sort of, rather than so like resisting the idea that for him, once he gets to eternity, that he's satisfied and he doesn't feel the need to go beyond to like simplicity or like further simplicity. And I was struck by the quotation that you gave, where let's see if I can reconstruct it. So Augustine is saying, so I read the Ten Commandments, right? And I come to know the truth of them, sort of like mediated through Moses. And the way you describe it is like, I'm trying to understand these. If I could be in the mind of Moses, I could, but I'm, and he's like coming, he's getting it from you. So now I'm going to kind of go to the source here. And he talks about, this kind of simultaneity, this like being able to see the truth of these moral laws all at once. I mean, the language he's giving is sort of this language that he uses elsewhere in the Confessions, where it's like, there's no syllable there, I don't have to have the syllabus, like a syllable. I'm so tired. Syllable by syllable as I'm saying something. It's not like spread out in time, but as like the sort of like, as I'm saying it. And there was some language of kind of like, all at once somehow seeing the truth. And it seemed to me that's like he does have something like this idea of the truth of truths, the vision of the whole. That like there's these mathematical truths, or there are these moral truths, or there are the Ten Commandments or whatever, and then there's the seeing of the truth, like the truth of the truth, and that's what he's identifying with God, and that's a higher unity, right? So the sense that like all of these truths are contained in truth itself, I think it's not. I think there's some move at. It's not, it's not nearly as complicated or, as developed later in the tradition as it, I think you're right, but it does seem like there's at least a moment in Augustine where he's doing, there is this kind of meta movement. The other example, even in on freedom of the will, he gives the 7+3 example, but he doesn't use that as his main example. He goes on to give this example of the order and truth of numbers, and it's like this totally complicated thing. Students always skip and they don't try and do it, right? But so it's like this kind of like mathematical fact about sort of how like you can talk about like the principle of how far from I won't be able to articulate, you're not talking about, right? So and it's this kind of complicated thing that mathematical truth that you really have to sit and kind of like work out and think about until you go, oh, I see what he's talking about. It is some kind of like universal truth about numbers, but it's nothing like 7+3 = 10, which is like easy. And we don't even think about what it is to sort of like discover that. So he gives an example of something you discover. So again, it's like this experience. And for him, it's really important that it's an experience, right? And so that you discover something that was kind of like always there and it's eternal. And, if you turn your mind's eye to it, you too can discover it. And here, do it. Oh, wow. Now I've had this experience. And I think it's important that it's demonstrative in that way, precisely because a moment of what's going on in there is the recognition of the truth, the experience of it.
Yeah.
Right. And so the connection with God is a kind of connection. It's like an experiential connection and not just a theoretical proof. Now I've shown there's something higher. it's really now I've experienced something higher.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And the way he talks, oh, sorry, go on.
No.
I was just going to say the way he talks about his encounter with truth in Confessions 11, like when the part where he's talking about Moses, I think bears that out. And in some ways I relate it back, if we're going to go back to earlier dialogues, I relate it back to De Magistro, right? The inner teacher stuff, because he kind of is explicitly hearkening back to it there in the Confessions when he says there's only one teacher, and it's Christ, and other people, will say things to you, and it may inadvertently cause you to learn something, but they're not teaching you, right? And so he's kind of playing with that idea too in the Moses passage in Confessions 11, where he's talking explicitly about Genesis 1, right? Because he starts Confessions 11 just by saying, well, let's spend a few books interpreting the beginning of Genesis, and the beginning of Genesis is in the beginning. Okay, let's stop there. Let's unpack that. What do we mean by in the beginning? Okay, well, the Manichaeans say this, but if we want to refute them, we need to have a proper philosophy of time and eternity. And so it's all caught up just in those three words. And those are the words that, first of all, he would love to have Moses to talk to about. But he's sort of saying, even if Moses were here, it would only be through almost like checking with the veritas within me, right? The truth that I have somehow have contact with. Could I verify the truth or falsity of what Moses was saying? And now that he's not even here, I will just have to do that. And I'll have to go within and see if I can hold up truths to the capital T truth. And, pointing to these New Testament proof texts where Jesus calls himself the truth, that's not particularly interesting. But I think Augustine in Confessions and in De Magistro and similar texts he's especially almost like virulent in his idea that when you realize that something is true, you are experiencing Jesus. It's the same capital T truth that became incarnate and walked around and preached the Sermon on the Mount and then was crucified and died and rose again. That is the same sort of truth that you're encountering, not in the mathematical proposition 7 + 3 = 10, but sort of that which allows you to realize that proposition is true, just is the truth that Jesus was. And again, I'm not saying he's in any way unique with that, but he is, I think, kind of distinctive in just how obsessed with that experience he becomes.
Yeah.
So maybe I just briefly ask a question. Just a brief comment. Dermot Moran spoke about how Augustine makes the point that God transcends the categories, and so there is a way in which pointing to the future developments, and so it's not as though it's just Augustine didn't really get it. He did get it, but we built upon him getting it. So it's not that, eternity is God, and it's just God isn't an aggregate of anything. So I think there's a lot to what Elizabeth's saying here. But and it echoes what Moran said the very first day. But I want to follow up on just since we're talking about truth and contradiction, I thought it would be interesting to ask about. I liked how you spoke about time when you're discussing Augustine as a field of contradiction. So I like this because there's a lot of contradiction here. There's a lot. And of course, if you read Plato, you start to realize, wait, what is becoming? It's the realm of what is and what is not. If you read the Republic, right? So is and is not and is not. And becoming is and is not, and it's not intelligible, but it is that which is and is not. And so it's a world of false being, but it is, and then if you import then Aristotle's idea that, false is a way of saying non-being. It's a way of kind of non-being being kind of thing. So I'm wondering, would it be right to say that not only for Platonism generally coming out of Plato, but also for Augustine, that there is a world of false being, of contradictory being? It is, but isn't true. And that was kind of first, just general question. Second, I'm interested in the legacy of this question about how does time relate to eternity. This is a wonderful question, and I'm thinking about Kant, for example, and the problem of schematism. So you have the empirical time, and you have your categories, and somehow one has to apply to the other. What's it going to be? Wait, it's going to be a priori time. And so it's, it's going to be time, which is pure and impure, right? And so you have this question comes up again. And I was reading Ernst Cassirer recently, because I'm supposed to be writing a book on this. And he draws on, he says that the Platonic tradition was really important for this move in Kant, that there's this moving image of eternity, as you mentioned, and that, for example, Kant, in applying substance to the appearances, uses the eternity of time itself, or I shouldn't say eternity of time, the timelessness of time, or the time itself is not in time. That there's a way in which time itself isn't coming and going. It's not as though you can find the time itself of time, right? So there's a way in which time itself is not temporal. And Kant actually uses that to make the world of appearances, or to apply the category of substance through the idea of time. So anyway, I'm just interested in the legacy of this problem as you see it all the way, since you wrote also this book on connecting these traditions. I thought it'd just be an interesting, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that. So we're going over a little bit, but yeah, sorry for the long question.
No, well, I'll keep my response fairly brief, because I don't think I'm up to tackling the Kant schematism or the Cassirer
That's okay.
part.
Yeah. This is a comment.
Sure, yeah, but I think I could maybe talk briefly about the time eternity relationship and the afterlife of that.
Yeah.
In modern thought, again, through the reception of the idea of something like a mystical now, and in figures like Bader. I think one of the things that draws folks like Bader to Eckhart is the rhetoric of the now, in which Bader seems to find something like almost like a fountain of youth within time or something. He uses a lot of alchemical rhetoric that somehow if we can inhabit the now in the right possible way, we're encountering some sort of intersection between the time and the timeless. But through this mediating force, which again he calls true time, and he's getting that again from esoteric Martinism rather than directly from Iamblichus and Proclus, although of course you could fill in some gaps about the history of Hermeticism and that sort of thing to maybe make those things fit together. And so that's kind of where we track it in the book, right? What does Eckhart mean about the mystical now? That's its own very difficult question. But how do the moderns kind of pick that up? What value do they see in kind of emphasizing this special understanding of the now or the present? The other angle of it is momentariness, which I get into more in the Augustine book, because there's a lot of momentary theories of time in ancient thought, like the Stoics, for example. And every once in a while that will become really popular again, even in sort of pop philosophy, right? You'll get these like websites that are all about modern Stoic advice for, getting through your day at work. Then you get advice about, here's what Marcus Aurelius says about living in the moment and things like that.
I think Stoicism is very hot right now, but I'm not the best with trends, so I really don't know.
But just to tie it all together, I think sometimes the mystical now, right, which should, I think, invite us to have somewhat more philosophically complicated thoughts about the relationship between time and timelessness. Sometimes that mystical now gets reduced to a sort of momentariness, right? If only we could kind of live in the now in this special way, then that would be what Eckhart and company have in mind. And I don't think that's correct. And that might be another way to relate Eckhart and those folks back to Augustine, because I think Augustine is actually in my reading, which not everyone agrees with, is an anti-momentary thinker.
Yeah.
And a lot of what he says about the present and about time is kind of the flow of negations rather than sort of a series of self-contained moments, actually might be a better way into understanding what folks like Eckhart are saying about about time and eternity and about the now. But I've never really, I'll be honest, I'll critique myself. I've never really been able to bring my thinking about Augustine on time fully together with my thinking about Eckhart on time. I've sort of done the Augustine side of things. And then with Eckhart and Cusanus, I sort of got pulled into the future with, how did they become popular again with folks like Bader and Hegel. But I think the next move, and that's what I tried to start thinking about more with this paper, so thank you for giving me that opportunity, would be doing a better job of trying to fill in the gaps that get us from Augustine to Eckhart on questions of the present and how time and timelessness ought to relate.
Do you have any comments about the time and the existence of contradiction from my first part of my comment?
Right. Yeah. Sorry. Could you just maybe restate
so
that?
just a brief comment about the idea in Plato that contradictions exist.
Okay.
Because becoming is real, and it is, and it's somehow a unity of being and non-being. It's just not intelligible.
Okay.
So there's a kind of realm of false being. This would be one way of reading and understanding becoming as a kind of false being.
Yeah, I'm not too sure how to relate that to Augustine right now, but I'll keep an eye out for it as I go back and work on this project further.
Okay, yeah, because it seems to be implied by the idea of time as a field of contradiction, as you said.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Okay, well, thanks so much. Let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come back for Ian's talk, who will finish up the conference. So you get the last word, Ian. So
I'll see what I can do. We'll
okay,
see how many people are around. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much. See you in a minute.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah,
Thanks, Sean. Thank you.
Eric, thanks for making it. How was bowling? Did you win?
Oh, yes, we did.
Okay, nice.
Yeah,
We
by,
have
by a good margin.
oh, good. We lost last year, so we
Yes.
do a like,
No,
graduate student.
we got it back.
We got it back. Nice.
Yeah.
Is this a university affiliated thing? The bowling?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Every year we have faculty versus grad students.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And we have a golden bowling ball trophy that goes either to the grad student library if they win, or to the departmental office if we win. And we lost last year and we just got it back.
Congratulations. That's so much
Yeah.
fun. I don't think my department has anything like this. We
Hmm.
used to have dinners before COVID, but
Yeah.
since we don't even have that anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get started. Thank you all for staying up late for our next and our final talk. Our next talk and final talk is by Ian Alexander Moore, who has the final word of our conference. Ian is an assistant professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, alongside Eric Pearl. So we have a couple representatives from there here at the conference. He's an expert in Eckhart, Heidegger, also works on Rainer Schumann. He has a really good book. I'd recommend everyone go out, buy it and read it. It's the Eckhart, Heidegger, and the Imperative of Releasement. I think that was SUNY 2019. I read the book, I took detailed notes, and I'm supposed to give Jason Wirth a book review a year ago. So my apologies to you, Ian, for that delay, but my hope is that it will eventually find its way into Jason's hands. Okay, so yeah, today's talk is A Christian Neo-Platonist on the reception of Eckhart in Heidegger and Schumann. So, floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. I'm really happy and honored to be here. I know the work of you and of so many of you, and I've learned so much from it over the years. So it's great to meet some people, see some people in person. And Sean and I have never met, I think, in person, but we've been at least like 10 like Zoom events together. So it's nice to see you again at another event. All right, so I have a PowerPoint here. Let me share that. Let me know if you can see that. Can everybody see that? Great. Okay, so my talk today will be titled A Christian Neo-Platonist on Truth and Contradiction in Heidegger's and Schumann's Reception of Eckhart. In a syncretistic essay on Plotinus and Heidegger, Rainer Schumann recounts a curious anecdote. One day, when Schumann and Heidegger were talking, the name Plotinus came up. Heidegger then asked a question that, were it posed by one of my graduate students, I could only find embarrassing. But is that not, Heidegger asked, one of the Neoplatonists? Whether this reveals a lack of familiarity with the Aeneids, as Schumann charitably interprets the question in the original French version of his essay, or merely a desire on the part of Heidegger to distance himself from the so-called founder of Neoplatonism, as Schumann more candidly maintains in the later English version, it does point to a gap in Heidegger's engagement with the history of Western philosophy. Despite announcing a course on Augustine and Neoplatonism in 1921, which turned out to be little more than a close, if idiosyncratic, reading of Book 10 of the Confessions, Heidegger rarely mentions the leading figures of pagan Neoplatonism, and when he does, it is frequently in an offhand or textbookish manner. Now, there would be little to object here. After all, no one can be well versed in the entire tradition of metaphysics, were it not for Heidegger's sweeping pronouncements on that very tradition, the most notorious of which is perhaps the claim that philosophers from Plato all the way up to Nietzsche have all succumbed to ontotheology, or as he is wont to put it rather vaguely, metaphysics. Ontotheology, according to Heidegger, concentrates on the being of entities and conceives of that being either as itself an entity or only in terms of entities. This entity or entity-like being is, to be sure, the highest insofar as it is the cause of entities, or in later formulations of itself as well. it is, in Heidegger's view, an entity or entity-like being nonetheless. Heidegger, for his part, often speaks of an ontological difference, but what interests him, and this is, I think, an important point. I think a lot of people misread Heidegger when he talks about an ontological difference. What interests him is not simply the difference between entities and their being, as is often said, but in what makes this difference possible, which he sometimes refers to with the archaic spelling sein with a Y. And this is often rendered in English with the even more archaic term in English, being with a Y. So we need to distinguish three things. So we have a threefold ontological difference, not simply a difference between two terms. And we need to distinguish first entities, das Seiende, or as he sometimes interprets it in terms of presence, things that are present, das Anwesende. Two, being, das Sein, or as Heidegger sometimes writes it, beingness, die Seiendheit, or again in terms of presence, Anwesenheit. And third, being with a Y, Sein with a Y, or in terms of presence, presencing, Anwesen, here taken verbally. When Heidegger accuses past philosophers of Seinsvergessenheit, of having forgotten being, or if you will, of an ontoamnesia, he means being with a Y in the third sense of the term, as indicated by his occasional spelling of the fault as Seinsvergessenheit, here with a Y. Although the Neoplatonists prefer to speak of the one, Tahen, to describe the most basic level of reality, their philosophies can also be characterized by a threefold difference, which Sherman calls a henological difference to distinguish it from Heidegger's ontological difference. So Sherman says there's this threefold difference in the Neoplatonists, but we shouldn't call it an ontological difference. We should call it a henological difference because we don't see the terminology of being at all three levels. So trying to map this out and following Sherman here, but modifying what he's doing a little bit. On the henological model, the one, whether it should be understood functionally and hierarchically, as Sherman argues, or foundationally and hierarchically, so functionally, anti-hierarchically, Sherman, foundationally and hierarchically, as Jean-Marc Narbonne stresses in his critique of Sherman, the one, in either way, should be conceived of neither as an entity, onti, nor as a god, theos, in relation to other entities, nor even as being, ta'an, or beingness, substance, ousia, which after all derives from the first hypostasis, but rather as their condition of possibility. And so here on this map, I was talking about this with Eric earlier. Entities, das Seiende, in Plotinus, I think that's ta aestheta, the things, sensuous things, but Heidegger would also place ta onta there. So anything, any kind of like individual being, or that can be compared with other beings or entities. And then corresponding to being or beingness would be ta'an, ousia, but we see ta onta there at that level in Plotinus as well. And then being with the Y, das Sein, we could map the one, Tahen, onto that. So Sherman is also very interested in trying to understand the one as verbal ani, to be. And he draws to support this from a remark initially attributed to Porphyry, but later ascribed to the so-called Anonymous of Torino, that quote, and this is the Anonymous of Torino, the one that is beyond substance, ousia, and beyond being, ontos, or l'éton, in Sherman's translation, maybe more clearly here, entities, is neither being, éton, perhaps better, an entity, nor substance, nor act, but rather it acts and is itself pure acting, so that it itself is the to be, ta enai, that which is prior to being for entities, ontos. So Sherman goes on to say, well, ta onta, number one in the Anonymous of Torino, would correspond to das Seiende. I'm not sure whether that's the case in the Anonymous of Torino. I'm just kind of going with Sherman there, but we would need to look more closely into that. So whatever the case may be there, and whatever distinctions would need to be drawn between the Neoplatonic hen and einai, or being with a Y, which Heidegger also exposits as one from time to time, Plotinus and his followers are hardly ontotheologists in Heidegger's sense of the term. Werner Bayerwaltes was therefore right to turn the charge back against their accuser and to speak of a Plotinvergessenheit, an oblivion of Plotinus in Heidegger's corpus. If Heidegger is uncompromising or at best evasive in his relegation of pagan Neoplatonism to Seinsvergessenheit, there is one author within the tradition of Christian Neoplatonism whom he is willing to exempt from his thesis on the historical confines of ontotheology. So this is remarkable. To my knowledge, he doesn't do this with other figures, but he does do so with Eckhart. I'm referring to Eckhart, whom Heidegger calls an alter Lese- und Lebemeister, an old master of letters and life, and whom he ranks among the few great thinkers of the West. So thinkers are deeper than philosophers for Heidegger. Okay, so Eckhart has lots of different terms, but here's one attempt to map some Eckhartian terminology onto Heidegger's threefold ontological difference. Eckhart's verbal conception of being, Middle High German Wesen, exceeds the difference between created things, das und das, or in Latin, hoc et hoc, this and that, and the being that is proper to them, Middle High German Ich. Indeed, Scherman relates that Heidegger admitted to having read Eckhart precisely at a time in which Heidegger was attempting to develop his own verbal event-like conception of being with a Y as Anwesen or presencing, in contrast to present things and their presence. Regarding ontotheology, Heidegger recognizes the new step that Eckhart takes in, for example, the Parisian question, the first Parisian question, when Eckhart denies the attribution of ends and even of esse to God. So he says both are not applicable to God. Thereby, in the words of the theologian Bernhard Welter, with which Heidegger declares himself to be in agreement, and so this is the moment in which Heidegger says Eckhart escapes ontotheology, Eckhart thereby frees himself from metaphysics, that is to say, metaphysics in Heidegger's restricted sense of the word as ontotheology. One problem here with respect to the theme of this conference is that Heidegger, in contrast to Scherman, neither with few exceptions interprets Eckhart as specifically Christian, nor situates him within the lineage of Neoplatonism, let alone asks how Eckhart's place within these specific traditions relates to the status of truth and contradiction and to their implications for the possibility of the good life. And so it's on these themes that I'll eventually focus: truth, contradiction, the good life. Heidegger instead tends to decontextualize Eckhart and to see in him the founder of a distinctly German philosophy, of which Heidegger sees himself as an heir. One quote for this: in Eckhart, a fully new way of questioning and thinking, which we today call existential, breaks through, uses the breakthrough language, durchbricht, the framework of the conceptual and linguistic usage of the Middle Ages. So Eckhart is a precursor to Heidegger. Heidegger, questionably, to be sure, distinguishes this German philosophy with its interest in abyss over ground and in unconcealment over correspondence from European rationality, from Christian philosophy, and from Neoplatonism, with which, again, quite questionably, Heidegger asserts that Neoplatonism is already pervaded by Judeo-Christian and Roman thought. So that's Heidegger on Neoplatonism. It will thus, I think, be more fruitful to discuss Rainer Scherman's path-breaking, if also controversial, reception of Eckhart. But first, let me say a few things about Heidegger's reception, with which, after all, Scherman is in constant dialogue. So first, regarding truth and Gelassenheit, or releasement. Releasement is a term that Eckhart coined in its Middle High German form Gelassenheit in the 1290s as a synonym of detachment, or Abgeschiedenheit, or Abgeschiedenheit in modern German. Cognates of which Eckhart eventually links with his verbal understanding of being and with his understanding of the abyssal Godhead that is conceptually prior to God the Father as person of the Trinity. Heidegger, drawing on Eckhart, ties releasements which especially in modern German also connotes serenity and calm composure, to his efforts to remember the source of the ontological difference, that is, being with a Y, number 3 in this schema. Although elsewhere in his corpus, Heidegger uses the term releasement to characterize a variety of things, including the essence of thinking and the very way of being with a Y itself. My philosophical approach to the Eckhart-Heidegger connection takes as its point of departure several passages. The first is a comment that Heidegger made to Karl Jaspers in 1949. Heidegger wrote, "Since 1910, the master of letters in life, Eckhart, has accompanied me. This and the always new attempt to think through Parmenides' toga auto noein estin teka einai, thinking and being are the same, the constant question about the auto, the same, which is neither noein, thinking, nor einai, being, the lack of the subject-object relation in Hellenism, Greciantum, brought me to what in proximity to my own thinking looks like a reversal, but is still something else and prior to it." The second set of passages that inspire my reading can be seen here on this slide. The first of these three comes from Eckhart's 30th German sermon, known by its Latin title, Predica Verbum, Preach the Word, from 2 Timothy. "Whoever wants to understand my teaching of detachment must be very detached, abgeschieden." Or in the language of releasement, this time from German Sermon 10, "No one can hear my word or my teaching unless they have released themselves." So you see gelassen there, gelassen in modern German. Or again, as Eckhart puts it in terms of truth in his famous 50-second sermon on spiritual poverty, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," from the Sermon on the Mount, "unless you are like this truth of which we want to speak, you cannot understand me." Why might Heidegger identify Eckhart and Parmenides as two crucial sources of his thinking? Additionally, how might one connect Eckhart's teaching of detachment, or better releasement, to the reciprocity of thinking and being as presented by Parmenides? So here's my claim. For Eckhart, the essential way of being of the human, Parmenides is knowing in a very loose sense, is identical to the essential way of being of the Godhead. Parmenides is einai, again in a very loose sense. What, we could ask, is this way of being? It is releasement. But as Eckhart clarifies, I can only know this truth if I live in accordance with it. Theory then is dependent on praxis, or what I call after Sherman, a practical a priori. And yet, despite this dependence, Eckhart does not fall silent, but rather helps his readers in a variety of ways to fulfill the imperative of releasement. Heidegger, for his part, takes over both the formal structure of the identity, or as he prefers to call it, not an identity, but a sameness that doesn't completely abolish difference, between thinking and being in Parmenides and the practical a priori in Eckhart. He also, like Eckhart, deploys extra discursive linguistic strategies to attune his readers to releasements. Now, I use the word formal here because for a fateful and fatal period, the content of Heidegger's discourse could hardly be more opposed to Eckhart's call to Gelassenheit, even though I think there's still this same formal structure that he's trying to understand in terms of the identity between thinking and being by way of Parmenides. I'm referring to the 1930s when Heidegger chooses not the path of universal releasement, but that of particular willfulness, not the path of peaceful peregrination, but that of violent nationalism, despite the fact that the Eckhartian path was not only viable, but even based on certain texts by Heidegger, such as the still untranslated Einleitung in die Philosophie from 1928-1929, an even more plausible course for him to take. So Heidegger didn't have to go in this direction. For the late Heidegger, this structure is as follows. So now I'm jumping to the late Heidegger after the National Socialist misadventure. To understand the deepest meaning of being is letting, to understand that the deepest meaning of being is letting, I must let go of what he calls willful, transcendental, horizontal thinking, and let myself engage in what he calls meditative thinking, which he interprets as releasement. The second thing I want to mention about Heidegger's reception of Eckhart before turning to Sherman is the status accorded to contradiction. Contradiction is not as prominent of a theme in Heidegger's relation to Eckhart as is releasement, and as I said above, he does not tie it overtly to Neo-Platonism or to its Christian adaptation. But there are a few passages in which Heidegger shows interest in the topic of contradiction in Eckhart, so I want to spend a little bit of time on this. In his 1934 evaluation of his student Cato Oltmann's dissertation on Eckhart, Heidegger provides a general approach in commenting on the dialectical character of the Meister's writings. So I reproduce this dissertation evaluation in my book in the original German as well as in an English translation, but it exists in the archives of the University of Freiburg. Heidegger writes, the author, Oltmanns, uses this traditional label, that is dialectics, to demonstrate that the opposing determinations, gegensätzliche Bestimmungen, which Eckhart makes of the essence of God, the essence of the world, and the essence of the human, are both true and untrue, according to whether one thinks them together in a higher essential unity or posits them individually in mutual exclusivity. We can see how Heidegger himself interprets these dialectical determinations at various points in his career. Heidegger takes up the question of Eckhart's understanding of God and indirectly of the created world in 1931 in the midst of a critique of the medieval analogy of being, which Heidegger, without further explanation, views not as an answer to the Seinsfrage or question of being, but as, quote, a title for the most stringent aporia, the impasse in which ancient philosophy and along with it all subsequent philosophy right up to today is enmeshed, end quote. Whatever he might mean by this, Heidegger does, once again, see Eckhart as an exception. Meister Eckhart, he says, the only one who sought a solution, says, and this is from the Parisian question, God is not at all because being is a finite predicate and absolutely cannot be said of God. And then Heidegger qualifies this. This was admittedly only a beginning, which disappeared in Eckhart's later development, although it remained alive in his thinking in another respect. Heidegger here refers to two stages in Eckhart's thinking, that of the aforementioned first Parisian question from 1302 to 1303, and that of the incomplete opus tripartitum, which Heidegger, apparently following the early 20th century scholarship of Martin Grabmann, believed to have been composed after the Parisian question, although more recent scholarship has called this chronology into doubt. So it was long thought that the opus tripartitum followed the Parisian question, but Loris Sturlese has argued for the opposite of that. In any case, Heidegger sees these two stages, or more cautiously here, these two positions as ultimately compatible. He speaks of them as the beginning that remained alive in his thinking. The position of the Parisian question ostensibly argues that it is best to conceive of God not as being, esse, but as understanding or intellection, intelligere. The position of the opus tripartitum, which resulted in the seeming disappearance of the first position, maintains that being is God, esse est Deus. The compatibility between these two positions can be found if we bear in mind Eckhart's use of the analogy of attribution and his deployment of what Bernard McGinn has called his in quantum principle. So I'll try to bring these two together to show how these positions can be made compatible. And this is related to my question for you, Greg, or a response to you. So I'll be curious to hear what you make of it. So according to Eckhart's view of analogy, whatever is one in one term, with regard to certain things, such as what he calls true causes, cannot properly belong in the other term or terms. So think about health, for instance. Health, properly speaking, is only in the animal. It's not in food or urine, which are only healthy in name. According to his in quantum or insofar as principle, certain objects can be spoken of in opposed ways, provided that the respect in which they are spoken of is taken into contradiction. And so this is why I said that I don't think stricto sensu he violates the law of non-contradiction as formulated by Aristotle, at least here. These 2 points about analogy and predication can be applied to God and creation as follows. If we wish to call God understanding, then he must have nothing in common with the creatures that one attempts to relate to him analogically. Thus, he has no being. If we call God being, in contrast, then creatures, insofar as they are taken as anything other than being, are nothing. There's no hierarchy of being here, no more or less being. Eckhart also expresses this idea in terms of commonality and particularity, as Heidegger himself noted much later in some notes on Eckhart's. So first quotes, omne commune in quantum commune Deus, et omne non commune in quantum non commune Deus non est. Insofar as something is common, it is God. Insofar as it's particular, that is to say, insofar as we're taking it in itself, it is not. Indeed, considered in themselves, creatures are nothing, for being belongs only to God. Thus, in saying that being is God, Eckhart is saying that beings, insofar as they are God. As he puts it in a German sermon that I have for you here, whoever takes a fly in God sees that it is nobler in God than the highest angel is in itself. All things are alike in God and are God himself. Yet this is one way to take them. It's one restricted way to take them. It does not diminish the fact that, quote, every created being smacks of the shadow of nothingness, end quote. Finally, humans can also be understood in opposed ways depending on the perspective one takes on them, whether as embodied, manifold, and temporal, or whether as in their ground of an undifferentiated single oneness, in enig ein ungeschieden, with the selfsame ground of God. Another step is required, however, to move from the untruth of these dialectical determinations taken individually to what Heidegger calls the truth of their higher essential unity. This shift occurs by means of Abgeschiedenheit, detachment, or cutting away from corporeality, multiplicity, and temporality, or better by means of Gelassenheit and its cognates, which connote not only releasement from and letting go of, but releasement to and letting be. Here, all things become sheer God to you, as I think Brett mentioned, or at least we talked about that during the Q&A. As Eckhart puts it in a German homily cited by Heidegger, releasement, as I read it, is ultimately a state of being in which we have come to recognize our primordial unity with the Godhead, and in which we live out this unity aimlessly, blissfully, and equanimously in all our thoughts and activities, letting all things be as having proceeded from out of the very letting be of the identical source of God and the soul. Eckhart's determinations of God, the world, and the human are not merely contradictory ontological descriptions based on the different perspectives we can take on the world. They're deployed in the service of releasement, where the oppositions are, to use Hegel's language, aufgehoben, not so much conceptually, however, or in Heidegger's language at the level of thinking. This is what he meant by true according to whether one thinks them together in a higher essential unity, but experientially, as I think we were talking about with Elizabeth, and as she was emphasizing in her paper. Heidegger saw Eckhart as a master of both the scholarly and the pastoral, of both letters and life, but it's noteworthy that the source of his phrase, Leser und Lebermeister, differs considerably from its later adaptation, or more accurately, transformation. And so this is the question, is Eckhart ultimately a Lesemeister, or is he more focused on the practical? Is he a Lebermeister? Maybe both, but this quote, this thing for which Heidegger is well known, he's a Leser und Lebermeister. Here, listen to it in its original formulation. Weger wäre ein Lebermeister, denn 1000 Lesemeister. Better a master of life than 1,000 masters of letters. I now want to turn to Scherman's own reading of Eckhart as developed less in Maître Eckhart ou la joie errante, Wandering Joy, which has been a mainstay in Eckhart's scholarship ever since it was published in French in 1972, then in the underappreciated book-length material on Eckhart in Scherman's posthumous opus magnum, Des Hégémonies brisées, Broken Hegemonies, first published in French in 1997. The reason I want to focus on Sherman's later work is because his earlier study, despite its sensitivity to the Christian Neoplatonic strand of Eckhart's texts, nevertheless largely follows Heidegger in treating releasement as a resolution. So we're going to see that in the later work, releasement is not going to be a resolution of the contradiction. It's going to be a releasement to a certain contradiction. I'll talk more about that. It is not enough, writes Sherman in Wandering Joy, to read Eckhart with reference to the theory of the preexistence of all things in God or the theory of divine ideas. To be content with, pratiquer, such a Neoplatonist reading of Meister Eckhart would mean to auscultate the letter of his sermons, unmindful or forgetful, oublieux, of releasement. Instead of a dissection of the text, however important this may be, I'm thinking here of Vladimir Lossky's masterful study of Eckhart and his Neoplatonic sources. We ultimately, on the reading of the early Sherman, need to hearken unto its spirits, even if this hearkening should lay waste to all our conceptions of God, self, and world, and lead us into the ineffable desert of the Godhead. So again, quoting Sherman, the early Sherman, the desert is not fertile in anything. Likewise, the Godhead is arid. It does not create anything. In the desert, everything begins only, but God disappears. The desert is a vast solitude. There is no place for two in the desert. The opposition between a creator and a creature vanishes. In the desert, entreaties are of no avail. There is no opposite of man towards whom he might raise his hands. In the desert, the wind and the sand wipe out the traces of the caravans. The steps of God disappear together with those of man and world. Only in this radical kenosis of God, self, and world, or to express it in the more specifically Christian language of the first version of Sherman's dissertation, composed for the faculty of the Dominican School of Theology, Le Sauchoir, only in following Christ on the way of the cross without the slightest anticipation of Easter, only in doing this can we appropriate our original freedom and live it out in the world. Final quote from the early Sherman, a man who has experienced this goes back to the business of the world, the stable or some other trade. He is no longer eager to hold God, to grasp God. He knows that eagerness, even mystical, makes one forgetful of the nothingness of the origin. Eagerness wants to get hold of God as though to envelop his head in a cloak and put him away under a bench. In his learned ignorance, reference to Kusa there, he has abolished all relation and otherness. He no longer knows the singular. He has experienced the failure of God represented as opposite to man. His joy comes from afar, from the unfathomable ground of the Godhead. Sherman's reading of Eckhart in Broken Hegemonies, in contrast, proposes not releasement from the discrepancies between God and the Godhead, between the hierarchical order of creation, qua created, and the equality of creatures qua divine, and between the corporeal, temporal human being and the incorporeal, eternal ground or spark of the soul, through an affirmation of the second terms in these sets. So he's not looking for a resolution, but rather a releasement to these discrepancies as insuperable. A releasement to these discrepancies as insuperable. In other words, in his final work, Sherman does not take the aforementioned step of moving from the respective untruths of the contradictory perspectives on God, creation, and the human being toward the truth of their unity in serene, joyful releasements. He instead affirms the truth of their contradictoriness, or rather, in his language, the truth of the differend of the inextricable double bind in which they place us. So one could speak here of a dialetheia. Although in Sherman, as in Eckhart, I don't take the terms of the contradiction to hold in the same respect. Again, so I don't think it's I guess, a contradiction in the most robust sense of the term. The distinction between the natural law instituted by God and the call to the pure nature of the Godhead that breaks it, between principle or ground and origin or abyss, cannot be reduced to P and not P to core. The conflicting claims on our allegiance instead resemble those which the tragic heroes of antiquity suffered. Save your daughter or slake your thirst for revenge and empire. Bury your brother or obey your king. Know your origins or save face. Neither is without fault, but, and here is the lesson, in choosing one, we need not blind ourselves to the other, let alone with Agamemnon, presume an exclusive passion for the one alone. Sherman's general aim in Broken Hegemonies is both critical and constructive. Providing close readings of the institution of the Greek one in Parmenides and its destitution in Plotinus, of Latin nature in Augustine and Cicero and its denaturing in Eckhart, and less so in the medieval nominalists, and of vernacular self-consciousness in Luther and Kant and its far-reaching collapse in Heidegger, Sherman endeavors to show how the history of Western philosophy represents a series of failed attempts to dominate otherness and singularity in the name of complete uniformity and universality. Sherman proposes instead not the abolition of universals, but ways in which to recognize their exclusionary role and to prevent them from becoming all-encompassing. For the purposes of this paper, I want to concentrate on his discussion of contradiction in the introduction and on its applicability to his reading of Eckhart in the latter half of the second part of Broken Hegemonies. And I'll say a few words in the conclusion about the possibility of the blessed life in light of this tragic thinking. In the introduction to his nearly 800-page treatise, Sherman explains his understanding of the difference between a contradiction, French contradiction, German Widerspruch, and a differend, French différent, German Widerstreit, with recourse to Heinrich Hertz's work on electromagnetic energy and to Wittgenstein's appreciation thereof. Hertz had experimentally proven James Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, thereby demonstrating, for example, that magnets affect iron-containing objects in their vicinity, not instantaneously, but at the speed of light. What, however, was the precise nature of the forces that Hertz's apparatuses were able to capture? Were they, as physicists still wonder with respect to quantum scale objects today, waves or particles? Rather than tormenting himself with the search for a solution at the ontological level, Hertz was eventually content to work with both models, which proved equally useful. A magnetic field with given force X results from waves traveling at frequency Y. Again, a magnetic field with given force X results from corpuscles displaced at velocity Z. The contradiction was not resolved for him, it was merely eliminated as a problem plaguing the mind. Take this quotation from Hertz, which Wittgenstein had considered using as the epigraph to the philosophical investigations. Even after these painful contradictions have been eliminated, the question of being will not have been answered. But the mind, no longer tormented, ceases to ask this question it considers unjustified. So that's Hertz. Some conflicts can in fact be resolved by the clarification of language use or by new evidence, such as that in support of the undulatory character of electromagnetic energy. Sherman, following Hertz and Wittgenstein, calls these resolvable conflicts contradictions. So the way he uses the term is for a resolvable conflict. Conflict is a contradiction. Other conflicts cannot be so resolved. Sherman calls these conflicts differends, extending their usage beyond physics, for which they may not be appropriate anyway. I'm not sure this example with Hertz really is that suitable. After all, the case is not closed on wave-particle duality in quantum mechanics today. So he at least takes their usage beyond physics, and he takes their usage beyond questions of communication. So you might be familiar with the term differend and Jean-Francois Lyotard and his use of the term. He leaves them behind in the realm of physics and communication and moves them into metaphysics. Although he discusses many differends throughout Broken Hegemonies, perhaps the most relevant and wide-reaching is the differend between the universal and the singular, which Sherman contrasts with the universal particular pair. During the reign of what Sherman calls hegemonic phantasms, all individuals are deemed to fall under the sway of a maximal universal. They are particulars of it. What is not supposed to, and yet invariably does, fall outside of that universal is a singular in Sherman's terminology. Here's how he explains the difference. A phantasm is hegemonic when an entire culture relies on it, as if it provided that in the name of which to speak and act. Such a chief represented, hegemon, works upon the unspeakable singular when it calls it a part of a whole. Hegemonies transform the singular into a particular. They serve to say what is, to classify and inscribe, to distribute proper and common nouns. Life is paid for by denying the singular, or in the vocabulary of a priorism, by subsuming it under the figure of the particular. Now, what then would become of principles if the singular, obliterated by the subsumptive phantasms, were to be reaccredited? Would not an inextricable double-bind, double prescription, follow? Note that the reaccreditation of the singular does not deny the claim of the universal and affirm an extreme form of nominalism in its stead. It denies the claim of the universal to be all-encompassing. In his earlier work, including Wandering Joy, but especially in Le Principe d'Anarchie, Heidegger, Les Questions de l'Agir from 1982, translated in 1987 under the more tepid and teleologically dubious title, Heidegger on Being and Acting, From Principles to Anarchy, Sherman had considered the possibility that principle-based thinking might one day, at the end of metaphysics, give way to a truly anarchic way of life. A joyful life without why, to borrow a famous phrase from Eckhart, that Heidegger, for his part, glimpsed in texts such as Der Satz vom Grund, but from which he ultimately averted his gaze. Broken Hegemonies, however, calls into question such post-metaphysical aspirations. So I'm much more interested in the Sherman of Broken Hegemonies than in his Heidegger book. If from the perspective of Sherman's final book, the term anarchy is to be retained, it, he says, cannot be taken to mean the consigning of the archai to the philosophical tools henceforth obsolete, and then going off to settle happily in a place deprived of principles. So this is a self-critique, even though he doesn't acknowledge it as such. Anarchy, if we're to retain the term here, becomes rather an ontological description of the irreconcilable conflict or differend between principles and their undermining, between a natal maximizing tendency and a mortal singularizing one in the human, between, in Heideggerian terms, appropriation, Ereignung, and expropriation, Enteignung, at the heart of the event, Ereignis, and between, in Eckhartian terms, the natural order established by the creator God and the pure nature of the Godhead. Following Gregory Bateson, Sherman describes this conflict as a double bind. Although he offers no way out, indeed the presumption of escape is one of the problems, Sherman does believe that this conflict can be coped with, which is not to say that it can be resolved, by learning how not to deny the tragic truth. Perhaps one might reply that this perspective of the later Sherman is no longer Eckhartian. It's a strange reading of Eckhart, at any rate. Yet Broken Hegemonies contains one of the most innovative, perhaps strange readings of Eckhart as precisely a thinker, indeed a lover of this double bind. In chapters 11 through 13 of the first volume of Broken Hegemonies, Sherman demonstrates how in Eckhart, the foundational archic God that ensures order and the abyssal anarchic Godhead that dissolves it are both normative. Differently, to be sure, but without any possibility for ultimate reconciliation. Quote, indifferent with each other, they put man in the tragic double bind. Normative reinstitution and normative destitution make up what Meister Eckhart is all about. Remarkable claim. That's what Meister Eckhart's all about. Normative reinstitution and normative destitution simultaneously without escape. Now, this contrasts with what Sherman had been hoping to find in Duns Scotus and Occam, whom for a long time he considered to be better candidates to examine the collapse of natural law before deciding in favor of Eckhart. Eckhart's thought, as described in Broken Hegemonies, if not in Sherman's earlier work on it, is more sober, let us say, than what Sherman was looking for in that of the Franciscan voluntarists, who try to escape the double bind at the most basic level. Scotus does, to be sure, distinguish between absolute power, God's ability to act in a radically different manner than he has hitherto, and ordained power, the contingent order that God has in fact instituted. But this fails, from Sherman's perspective, to locate the fracture within God himself. According to broken hegemonies, singularization in Eckhart, whether it be that which pulls me toward my death or that which dephenomenalizes phenomena in advance, is always accompanied by an incongruous universalization, that is, by subsumption under nature as law. The latter, like universals in Occam's most extreme version of nominalism, may well be a kind of fiction or fabrication, quodam fictum, but nature as law cannot be resolved through logical clarification, as Occam, you could say, might have attempted. One lives by it and by the law of the pure nature of the Godhead, tragically. Quote, the man of non-attachment, l'homme détaché, is not a friend of the man of law, but both of them are me, end quote. Denying the denial of the legislative tragic, Eckhart in Sherman's reading could be dubbed a medieval Sophocles. Although Sherman offers a nuanced interpretation of Plotinus in part 1 of Broken Hegemonies and claims that the non-entitative, functional, event-like, discontinuous transcendence of Plotinus's one destitutes the prior status of the one as phantasmatically hegemonic, although earlier in his career he had claimed that Plotinian henology escapes metaphysics in Heidegger's pejorative sense of the term, and although at one point in Broken Hegemonies he maintains that by including Eckhart among the Christian Neo-Platonists, one gains hardly anything more than a vague concept of vertical integration, Sherman nevertheless uses the label Neoplatonic and sometimes Christian Neoplatonic throughout the book to characterize Eckhart's discussion of the hierarchical order established by God the Father. Neoplatonic here refers to a continuous cosmological order in which, writes Eckhart, quote, the highest part of the lower touches the lowest part of what is higher. That's from his Latin works. In other words, Sherman explains one in which the end of each being is posited by the level that precedes it in rank and file. Chapter 12 of Volume 1 of Broken Hegemonies treats of this hierarchical Neoplatonic dimension of Eckhart's thought. Sherman also calls it a strategy, where, quote, what is prior and superior receives nothing at all of what is posterior, and where the superior descends with its properties into what is inferior and posterior. But there is another dimension or counter strategy, which, when heeded properly, pulls away the, quote, quasi-feudal scaffolding in which each thing puts its feet on the head of its neighbor, end quote. Chapter 13 of the book treats of this counter strategy. Alongside the principle of continuity, Eckhart places the injunction to live without why, ohne warum leben, or as he says near the beginning of his Latin commentary on John, hoc enim propria vivit, quod est sine principio. Only what is without principle lives properly. What is remarkable about the interpretation in Broken Hegemonies is, as I already indicated, that this counter strategy, wherein we become like the Godhead, does not do away with the strategy of order, but binds us at the same time as does the strategy of order. This has far-reaching implications for the happy life, as Sherman now conceives it toward the end of his life. It's on this point that I want to conclude. Sherman notes that happiness or blessedness for Eckhart is more complicated than one might expect from a superficial reading of Eckhart's sermons, or I would add from reading Sherman's earlier work on Eckhart. It is not enough to say with Eckhart that our happiness, Bonheur in Sherman's French, Seligkeit in Eckhart's German, resides in this, that man pierces through and traverses all that is created, as well as all temporality and being, that he passes into the ground that is without grounds, end quote. It is furthermore not enough to say that happiness consists in loving, that is, in an act of willing, or in knowing the highest object, namely God. Rather, and as if interpreting Eckhart as a tragic thinker par excellence of the double bind were not already among the most innovative readings of the Meister, Sherman claims that it is precisely here in tragic conflict that Eckhart teaches his congregation to find their joy. The double bind of the nominative natural law, God is ground, Grund, and infinitive pure nature or naturing, the Godhead as abyss, Abgrund, expresses the secret of happiness, tragic in the sense of incongruous ultimates, just as it first expresses the mystery of being, agonal in the sense of being and beings in a differend. Neither happiness nor being is designated simply, plainly by name. This should come as a surprising development to anyone who is familiar with Maître Eckhart ou la joie errante, wherein Eckhart promises not an errant or intermittent relation. That's the position here, this kind of errant, intermittent, erratic relation to conflicting claims. But Eckhart instead proposes a serene wandering, errance, without why and hence without regard for error. We would, at any rate, seem to be far from the consolations afforded by Schurmann's earlier study and by the late Heidegger's appropriation of releasements. The Eckhartian double bind between the indeterminate freedom of the divine origin and God as the principle of order is instead horrifying, as Schurmann depicts in perhaps the most macabre comparison ever made of the Dominican teacher of peaceful peregrination. It's an astounding quote. The normativity of the initial emptiness, of absolute freedom, of the actuality of being, only makes sense when, against nature, they are coupled with the principle, counteracting or giving the lie to the impetus of natality and quashing the phantasm that it maximizes. It is a coupling reminiscent of the ones practiced by those terrible Maniote pirates who would lash their prisoners face to face with a corpse and abandon them on an island, thus coupled to their fates. Theirs is a brutal lesson in the singularization to come, too literal a double bind. Still, it deals with tragic knowledge. To think would be to anticipate this kind of lesson. The Ursprung has, in short, become not merely an originary upsurge, jaillissement, as could be seen in Schurmann's earlier studies of Eckhart, but an originary fissure. It is in the space of this fissure, not on any solid rock, that, according to Schurmann reading Eckhart, happiness resides. It will admittedly not be enough for the late Schurmann to read Eckhart alone, since the medieval mystic lacks the historical sensibility requisite not merely for the destitution of one hegemonic phantasm among others, but for the peremption and unclenching, the dessaisie, of the grip of hegemonic phantasmic thinking as such. Wonderful or horrible to say, Heidegger's path will also need to be followed, as Schurmann anticipates with the Heideggerian terminology of agonal being and fissuring in the above quotations. So I'm thinking about that quotation. Nevertheless, according to Broken Hegemonies, Eckhart was the one who first forged this path. He is not merely a medieval master for Schurmann. Along with Heidegger, Eckhart remained Schurmann's master in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your very informative, stimulating talk. So we have time for questions because we're at the end of the conference. So the advantage here for those of you who have survived late into the night, a couple exceptions, is we can talk for as long as Ian doesn't and the others don't fall asleep. Okay, so I'm opening up for questions. We can also look on YouTube and see if anyone is have any questions for us. Okay, so there's nothing on YouTube, so the floor is open for questions or comments. Maybe I just start with a comment. Thanks a lot for the talk. I have a question that I want to ask later, but I'll just start with a comment. I appreciate your affirmation of Heidegger engaging in a Plotine-Vergessenheit. I think that is very fitting and accurate, and it's a problem. And this critique of ontotheology Heidegger engages in, although important, obviously has a huge prehistory and the whole history of Western philosophy going all the way, not even Plotine, but even back to the Plato himself, the recognition that the good is beyond being. So there is a fundamental. So I just wanted to, yeah, thank you for this, and also, even if it's not new to you, I wanted to ask you a question just about a reading of Heidegger. I'll stick with the Heideggers. I had an easier time with this than with the Sherman. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what's going on there.
Yeah.
It may take me a little while to
yeah, me too.
Okay, good. Yeah. So with the Heidegger, I'm really, especially having read your book, I think that you draw very important links between Heidegger and Eckhart. And I wanted to ask you about some readers of Heidegger who place emphasis on the Taoist influence in late Heidegger's thinking. So some readers like Eric Nelson, David Chai, they're actually both here in Hong Kong. One of them is my colleague, the other one's at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, who see the way of Gelassenheit that you're linking with Eckhart as also having its roots in Taoism. And they give examples like the Thing, this story about the jug and the emptiness of the jug. And so I'm wondering, to what extent, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that there's a strong presence of something like these Taoist ideas that are kind of intermingling with the Eckhartian ones in the later Heidegger after the 30s, or is it? Do you think that that's overplayed?
Yeah, I think it depends on how we want to approach it. I think if you want to approach it as a historiographic question, or like a kind of Quellenforschung, searching for sources, I don't buy the case based on the evidence. Heidegger occasionally refers to the Tao Te Ching as well as the Zhuangzi. I think there's an early reference already in 1929. And I think there's an opening there, but I just don't think there's enough evidence to claim that he was closely engaged with these texts such that he was. It's a secret influence, and that was a claim for a while. There's a book by Graham Parks, I think, that makes that claim. Yeah, and so I'm not really, like, as a scholar of Heidegger, I'm not really persuaded by it. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity for cross-cultural dialogue, for sort of trans-philosophical dialogue, as Heidegger himself was open to, right? Yeah. He wanted this kind of dialogue with the Far East. And it seems like he was attracted to Zen Buddhism as well, like Nishitani mediated this for him. But it seems like the Taoist influence is there already starting in 1929, if I recall correctly. So things like, I think Wu Wei would be really nice to bring that into dialogue with Gelassenheit. This non-action, or a kind of ability to go with the flow of things, or a kind of suppleness. I think that's Ru or Zhu, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, with regard to things. So I like that possibility, and I want to explore more of it myself. One of my graduate students, I don't know if he's following on YouTube, Weian Ding, is doing some work on this. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just use the opportunity to mention, since we're talking about the possible East-West links here, it's one of my interests as well, being in Asia and trying to cultivate those connections where they exist and where they could exist as well. Okay. Bye-bye, Eric. Thanks so much for coming to the conference.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. Is in your book, there is well, it's 3 years old now, but this translation of Nishitani's his referat, right, in the Heidegger seminar, that compares Eckhart and Nietzsche, right? So if you want to see Nishitani's, this was mentioned already in Brett Davis's talk, comparison of Eckhart and Nietzsche and how he sees them intertwining. You should look at Ian's book, because I'm doing a lot of promotion of your book here, because there's a lot of texts that are translated actually in the text. So it's not just Ian's commentary and discussion, but also a lot of new translations in the text, in the appendices at the end. I don't know, Ian, if you wanted to say anything about that. I know it's not exactly on the topic of the lecture here, but
I guess I don't have a lot to say there. I mean, it's something that I do want to explore more of, and that I'm interested in following up on. Yeah, are there any other questions or comments from anybody?
Well, I have a follow-up question, and maybe I'll ask, since you also asked me what I thought. So I think I will take the opportunity to answer your question you asked me in the talk, and then maybe this will also get a conversation going. Yeah, so I really appreciate the points you make, that this appeal to analogy is there, and it was very clear how that's working. If we think of God as being, the creatures are nothing. If we think of the creatures, what it is to be a creature, God is nothing, and there's no contradiction here. And you have this this very clear presentation of this point. There's kind of two things that come up when I think about this. One is that it seems that what we're dealing with here is a kind of God of distinction. So this is one of my worries, is we're dealing with something like the God who's not a creature and the creature who's not God. And so it seems to me that this account holds as long as we stay in the God of distinction. And that I would be happy in a way to acknowledge it, especially because it's there in the text. And I think it was an important qualification that you inserted, which was at least here. At least here. Because the at least here matters a lot, because it implies there may be an elsewhere. The God of the indistinction may appear. And maybe I'll just kind of indicate that, especially thinking about the principle of non-contradiction as a law governing distinction, at least traditionally coming back to Aristotle, ensuring that not everything is one. This is the important part. And Aristotle complains a lot about how if you violated it, everything would be one. And this isn't true. For him, it's not true. And so it's an important principle to preserve the distinction. So if you want God to be distinct, by all means, make it an absolute principle. But then this is kind of where I think back to Elizabeth's talk, where when Elizabeth was talking about exploding metaphors, for example, where you have the sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. And then when you attempt to think through that, what that means, then you fall into this contradiction where the center and the circumference become indistinguishable, right? And I think the way I would kind of follow up on your point about the analogy is, like, this is a kind of exploding metaphor, I would say, explodes in a way the God of distinction, and also explodes the appeal to analogy as well. Now, I'm not saying that at a certain level of analysis it doesn't hold, but I am saying that there are other places where, say, there are the spiritual exercises that we're called to engage in that do seem to challenge an analogy-only approach to being, or a distinction-only approach. So I would want to, maybe in a reconciliatory and also maybe more comprehensive attitude, want to think about both analogy and transcending it as well. And what that would look like as a whole picture maybe is not something we can exactly articulate, because that maybe is kind of the point. But somehow it seems to me that something like transcending the analogy is just as important as preserving it. So I don't know if that makes sense as a result, but I'm curious to hear what you would have to say. Also, just drawing on Elizabeth and your talks and thinking that this is the same Eckhart. So, or maybe not as Brett indicated. Maybe there's many Eckharts, and this moniker Eckhart may not be referring to one thing. So.
I think it's really hard. I'd be curious to hear other people's thought on this. I grant the point, and I'm very interested in those explosive moments as well. One question I have is whether Eckhart, even when all things become God to me, when there's this kind of reconciliation of transcendence and immanence, whether he still retains the desire to have all created things smack of the shadow of nothingness, as he says. Otherwise, I think the danger is that we end up in some kind of pantheism, like a kind of substantive pantheism. So maybe we have something like an experiential, possibility of sort of unification and all things becoming God. Sherman will talk about this in terms of like an event-like ontology or an imperative ontology, in contrast to an indicative or substantive ontology. So I guess my interpretive question would be, doesn't Eckhart always want to retain some degree of distinction so as to avoid the charge of like a substantial pantheism?
Yeah.
And so maybe, I don't know, that would be an interpretive question for us, whether he should do that or whether his own thinking actually ultimately militates against that. That could be another approach.
Yeah. That's a wonderful question. I think it's something to think longer about, something that won't be able to answer. And I know that there are different approaches to reading Eckhart. And if we want to avoid a kind of pantheism reading, we might then also ask something like, also, how does difference show up? So on the one hand, there's the transcending of difference and maybe the elimination of it. And then you might think that's just pantheism. But then there's also a reading where it's still dialectical, but the way the dialectic may work is different. So, for example, you can have a dialectical account of the Godhead where, and this is what I tried to offer in my own paper, where the indistinctness, which transcends all distinctions and therefore the law that governs them, nonetheless is still self-distinguishing. In other words, it's the principle that sets itself apart from the creatures. Like, this is the idea of self-differentiating a deity who creates the creatures out of himself. And this is also maybe part of the difficulty. A creation out of nothing and a creation out of God himself in such a way that the difference could be. So I don't want to say that the difference is not at all, because the difference is, but the difference is out of God himself, who is not constituted by the difference. And so, there's an extra added layer of thinking about different ways of understanding the dialectics. One way is to think of it in terms of this contradiction or self-distinguishing of God from the creature.
Yeah.
How exactly to talk about that without contradicting oneself repeatedly is not an easy matter to do. And I think that's part of the difficulty of the appeal to analogy works well, I think, once you have difference. But when you're talking about the origin of it, I think that is very difficult to speak without finding yourself in logical trouble. And I think in a way Eckhart knows that, and he's very self-consciously doing it, right? So it's not a surprise to any of us. But anyway, I don't want to go on about this, but I think maybe there is a way of avoiding a simple pantheism where it's just,
Yes.
while having a kind of dialectic of self-othering where God distinguishes himself from creatures and maintains it. So this question of what dialectic do we need for there to be analogy, or what dialectic is necessary also for there to be differences that are mutually exclusive and compatible.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether analogy is sufficient to account for itself. And
I
my
don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it's something I would want to bring into Sherman's work on this imperative character of Eckhart's thinking in contrast to an indicative character. And I think we can also bring the sort of dialectical approach that you're developing. Could I ask you all a question? You all know Eckhart's well. This reading of Sherman is so strange, right? I mean, that we have the Godhead on the one hand, and then we have the God the Father, and they're both legislative, they're both normative, and in a sense, we're in this bind. What do you make of? I'm just kind of curious because I haven't actually run it by Eckhart scholars. I've just been developing it recently myself. How does it strike you?
Could you summarize it briefly again? Because I was having trouble following it. Could you maybe in like 2 minutes or so?
Sure, I'll try to do it quickly. So rather than thinking that, let's say, the breakthrough to the Godhead is the ultimate move in Eckhart's, or some kind of reconciliation of contradictions, tensions is the move, Sherman says that there is that move in Eckhart's, but at the same time, he has this hierarchical, what he calls Neoplatonic order that's grounded in natural law, that's founded in God the Father, God the Creator. And rather than trying to like work these out, or like he does in his earlier, he says, no, they're just both binding. And all we have is something like the possibility of a kind of tragic recognition of this situation. And so he actually, this is Sherman's philosophy, his later philosophy in general. He tries to develop a philosophy of this double bind. What's interesting is he finds this in Eckhart, and then in a sense sees Eckhart as a precursor. Whereas just a few years prior, he had pretty much moved beyond Eckhart, or said Eckhart's, it's too like inward facing, it's not sufficient for the kind of political work I'm trying to do. And then at the very end of his life, as he's dying of AIDS at the age of 51, 52, he turns back to Eckhart as this paradigmatic thinker of a tragic double bind, and says, yeah, Eckhart's a kind of joyful, tragic thinker. He's kind of like Oedipus or a medieval Sophocles or something like that. So it's very strange. I mean, I think it's interesting for me, like to get this reading of Eckhart. I would love to get some Eckhart scholars to read this and just to talk about it with them at some point.
Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts about this? What it could mean, or what's the...
I'm so fried right now. It's hard for me
I hear you. I hear you.
I have to say I didn't know where to begin with this reading of Sherman's. And I don't know how much that has to do with my brain being fried. So one thing I will say though is that I feel like whatever's going on with coincidence of opposition is happening at the level of the Trinity for Eckhart, and the breakthrough I think it's something similar is going on with Cusa, with this garden, that the wall of oppositions.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I was trying to argue.
Yeah, so that was like one thing that I thought that I'm not already there. I'm not quite comfortable with how he's seeing it, and then to see it as an order, the Godhead as an order. I think it's so. I feel like also I kind of want to say Neoplatonism in general. There's something wrong about seeing like the one source, and then like the second hypothesis, the nous, and then soul as these like kind of separate moments of this kind of outflow, and then again these stages of return. If you think about it that way, and then it seems like you've got a hierarchy and you've got an order. But it seems like the one is always already there, and there's always already the flowing out and the flowing in. Yeah. And so I feel like in some like really fundamental sense, there's not an hierarchy. In
you
its
make that argument in your book.
Wait, what?
I remember you making an argument like this in your book about how if one were just distinct from the other hypostases, it really wouldn't have this absolute or all-encompassing, but it actually has to encompass in a way all of them, that being what it is to be beyond itself, and then, right? So that there is a way in which it's wrong to kind of just, you have this, and then you have that, and then you have this, is really not, there's something problematic. You somehow aren't seeing the character of the one correctly. You actually have a point about this in your book. If it's been a while since I looked at it, but
I probably did. Yeah.
I think so.
I don't know if that's what Sherman means when he says there's still an order because there's a hierarchy in sort of placing the one above and beyond even the, Trinity, the Trinity and the, birth of the word and all that.
So I think he wants to place the order not at the level of the one. He wants to say the Godhead, in a sense, disrupts that order. But God the Father or God the Creator institutes that order. And so there's at once a disordering and an ordering that are simultaneously binding.
It's like really Gnostic, right? I mean, it's really
Exactly.
kind of a. I
There's
mean,
two, are there two?
it's like the.
How many first principles are there? Because
in this case, I guess in this case, he doesn't want to. He doesn't think we can subordinate one to the other in a kind of neat way. Yeah.
That's interesting because even this whole problem that you're raising, this problem of this reading, there's a way in which our discussion about whether there's a real contradiction here reflects this in a way. Because on the one hand, we have the monkey wrench that Elizabeth was talking about. And on the other hand, we have the order that the wrench is, and interesting that Reiner is saying, look, we have both of those. And maybe it is a problem that what I want to do is really emphasize the disorder. And you want to bring us back here. And maybe he's saying there's both. Yes, and that's a problem, right? And so maybe he's onto something, even though it's strange, like you said.
Yeah,
I find something very appealing too about sort of this idea that natality brings in, like it just disturbs the whole thing, right? Yeah.
Is there something like autobiographical? I mean, you're talking about how he was dying, and then there's this tragic moment that then he reads into Eckhart himself.
Yes.
Do you think there's
here?
I
mean, I could spend a lot of time. I know it's late. I think everybody's tired, but I think his reading of Eckhart. I want to write. I mean, I've been working on an article, but I need to kind of finalize it. How his reading of Eckhart actually mirrors his own autobiographical struggles, beginning with his time as a student of theology at the radical school, Le Sauchoir. He finds in Eckhart specifically Christian characteristics, which he then kind of downplays after he is exiled owing to kind of homoerotic actions. He gets exiled from Paris. He downplays the Christian character. He eventually compares Eckhart with Soto Zen. So he has some pieces that I think you might find interesting there. In a kind of in a syncretistic way, the loss of origin in Soto Zen and Meister Eckhart. Eventually he becomes kind of dismissive of Eckhart as not able to speak to political concerns. I think Sherman becomes a political philosopher above all else. He is connected with Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt brings him to the New School. And then he develops this much more tragic reading at the end of his life, only in his final years also to be returning to the fold of Christianity in, interestingly, a kind of Eckhartian way, as a kind of return. So he writes an autobiography called Les Origines, wins the literary award. And all of this is connected with his guilt about being born in 1941 to Nazi parents. His father was probably involved in arms manufacturing. And so he flees his homeland. He doesn't write in German. He decides, I'm going to write in French and then eventually English. So a lot of this, I think, is biographical. And yeah, I'm hoping to kind of write something of an intellectual biography of Sherman, and this is a part of that work. So
it does seem like if you're going to take politics seriously, you have to take natality seriously. I mean, I appreciate that from Arendt. So I can, I don't know. I find this reading very interesting anyway. But like I say, I can't. I'm too tired to get my mind around it.
But nobody's talked about it. I mean, everybody knows Wandering Joy, like that's cited everywhere. but I mean, like Bernard McGee, I told him about broken hegemonies about a year ago, and like he just hadn't really, encountered it. And so I'd like to get Eckhart. I'd like to get some Eckhart scholars to read it, and just and to tell me like how it's impacted them. I think it's very, very strange, but very interesting from this biographical perspective.
Could you
him on trajectory? Yeah.
could you I would be interested in reading as much of it as I can and chatting about it.
Great.
Maybe I'll send you an email and you can direct me to what I should read, because
I can do that. Yeah, it's only about 80 or 90 pages on Eckhart and broken hegemonies. So.
Okay, great. Because it seems to me that one can use the Godhead itself as a principle of the order. I mean, this is actually what I've tried to do, is that actually it's a self-differentiating principle that in a way negates its own indistinction to give us the order.
Yes.
That's kind of self-vanishing principle that gives us, a world ordered by non-contradiction. So I don't know, maybe that's not something he's attracted to, because this may be too clean, or maybe there's then there's not a double, or there's not a duality kind of at the source of things. It's trying to think through this from a monotheistic point of view, not otherwise.
Not a Gnostic perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Or Manichaean, or I don't know, not Manichaean, but something dual. Or
I hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but I'm going to try to.
Plato's unwritten doctrine, right? One and indefinite dyad, or something like this. So you get one in plurality through the mixing. Well, look, thank you so much, Ian. We went a long time afterwards, but it was good to discuss this, and thanks for exposing us to Sherman's reading. And maybe you'll be able to inspire Eckhart scholars to engage with this at all, and then maybe in more depth. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. And just a final word, yeah, I think that the conference was a great success. I think we were able to really discuss a lot of issues central to Christian Neoplatonism and truth and contradiction, from working through the details of Eckhart and Cusa and Augustine, Origen, and others, but also thinking about the legacy. That was today, we talked a lot about the legacy, whether that's with Sherman or whether Heidegger, or whether this is 20th century Japanese philosophy, or whether it's the Cambridge Platonists. So we talked about them yesterday. So we also, even in conversation, spoke about the legacy of Christian Neoplatonism in German idealism. That was not so much a central topic of papers, but it came up a lot in conversation. So we've, I think, been able to work through, some of these central questions about truth and contradiction, whether there really are true contradictions or not, the relevance of even that question. We've even and then been able to explore the legacies of these ideas. So I don't want to go on anymore. I just want to thank all of you and all of the speakers who contributed to the conference. And all of these talks will be online. They'll be online indefinitely, so you can point people in the direction of your talk and rewatch them as many times as you'd like, or never again, depending on how you feel about it. Okay, so thanks a lot. And I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Greg, for arranging
Thanks
this.
so much, Greg.
Really,
Of course.
so valuable. Really.
Yeah, it was
Great
an awesome
experience.
event, awesome conference.
You all made it excellent. I just invited you and you showed up, so thank you so much for coming. Okay. All right, so have a good night. Go get some rest. Go get some sleep. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Jasmine. Thanks, Edward.
Bye-bye.